The Lost Oases, Chapter 1, The Desert. On my first trip through the Libyan desert, I took a vow. We had lost our way, and we had lost all hope. There was no sign of the oasis we sought, no sign of any well nearby. The desert seemed cruel and merciless, and I vowed that if ever we came through alive, I would not return again. 2 years later, I was back in the same desert, at the same spot where we had lost our way, and landed at the same well that had saved our lives on the previous occasion. The desert calls, but it is not easy to analyze its attraction and its charm. Perhaps the most wonderful part of desert life is the desert night. You have walked the whole day on blistered feet, because even walking was less painful than riding on a camel. You have kept up with the caravan with eyes half shut. You follow mechanically the rhythm of the camel's steps. Your throat is parched, and there is no well in sight. The men are no more in the humor to sing. Their faces are drawn with exhaustion, and with eyes bloodshot they keep a vague, hopeless look on the ever-faint line between the blue of the sky and the dull yellow of the sand. The sheepskin water vessels dangle limply on either side of the camels. We do not talk very much in the desert. The desert breeds silence, and when we are in trouble we avoid one another's eyes. There is no need for speech. Everybody knows what is happening, and everybody bears it with fortitude and dignity, for to grumble is to throw blame on the Almighty, a thing that no Bedouin will do. To the Bedouin, this is the life that was intended for him. It is the route that God decreed him to take. Maybe it leads to the death that the Almighty has chosen for him. Therefore, he must accept it. No man can run away from that which God has decreed, says the Bedouin. Wherever you may be, death will reach you, even though you take your refuge in fortified towers. But it is at such times as these that you vow, if your life is spared, that you will never come back to the desert again. Then the day's work is at an end. Camp is pitched. No tents are erected, for the men are too exhausted, too careless to mind what happens to their bodies. And night falls. It may be a starlit night, or there may be a moon. Gradually a serenity gets hold of you. Gradually, after a day of silence, conversation starts. Feeble jokes are cracked. One of the men, probably the youngest of the caravan, ventures a joke with more cheerfulness than the rest, and his voice is pitched in a higher key. Unconsciously, the Bedouins attune their voices to that higher, louder pitch, and the volume of sound increases. The desert is working her charm. The gentle night breeze revives the spirit of the caravan. In a few minutes, the empty fantasses are used as drums, and there is song and dance. At the first sound of music, men may have been tending the camels, repairing the luggage or the camel saddles, but that first note brings all the caravan around the embers of the dying fire. Everyone looks at his comrades to make sure that all are alive and happy, and everyone tries to be a little more cheerful than his neighbor to give him more confidence. There is a game of make-believe, a little ghastly in its beginnings. We force ourselves to be cheerful, to make light of our troubles. "The camels are all right. I saw to that wound, and it is not so bad as I thought," says one. "Bu Hassan says he has sighted the landmark of the well not far to our right," says another. We work ourselves up by degrees to a belief that everything is really all right. It is a bluff, maybe, from beginning to end, but the charm of the desert has prevailed. It is as though a man were deeply in love with a very fascinating but cruel woman. She treats him badly, and the world crumples in his hand. At night she smiles on him, and the whole world is a paradise. The desert smiles, and there is no place on earth worth living in but the desert. Song and dance take out from the men of the caravan the little vitality that is left after the ravages of the day. Their spirit is exhausted, and they fall asleep. They sleep beneath the beautiful dome of the sky and the stars. Few people in civilization know the pleasure of just sitting down and looking at the stars. No wonder the Arabs were masters of the science of astronomy. When the day's work is done, the solitary Bedouin has nothing left but to sit down and watch the movements of the stars and absorb the uplifting sense of comfort that they give to the spirit. These stars become like friends that one meets every day, and when they go, it is not abruptly as when men say farewell at a parting, but it is like watching a friend fade gradually from view with the hope of seeing him again the following night. To prayers, O ye believers, prayers are better than sleep. The cry comes from the first man of the caravan to awake. A few stars are still scattered in the sky. The men get up, and there is nothing better illustrates the phrase, collect their bodies. Every limb is aching, and again their throats are parched. Yet what changed men they are! There is hope in them, confidence, perhaps an inward belief that all will come well. The world then is a gray void, and only the morning fire breaks the cold north breeze. Our eyes instinctively turn to the east, where the sun is rising. If there are no clouds, there comes a yellowish tinge in the sky that throws a curious, elusive, elongated shadow behind camels and men, so faint that you can scarcely call it a shadow at all. Then comes a reddish tinge that gives warmth. It is just between dawnbreak and sunrise that there is color in the desert. Once the sun is risen, there is nothing but the endless stretch of blue and yellow, and the blue fades and fades until by midday the sky is almost wrung dry of color. Morning brings new vitality. Night brings peace and serenity. These are the hours wherein one learns of the desert's charm. In the silence of these vast open spaces, human sensitiveness becomes so sharpened that eventually the desert traveler feels the nearness of some inhabited oasis. Likewise, his instinct tells him of the few hundred miles that separate him from any breathing thing. In the silent infinity of the desert, body, mind, and soul are cleansed. Man feels nearer to God, feels the presence of a mighty power from which nothing any longer diverts his attention. Little by little, an inevitable fatalism and an unshakable belief in the wisdom of God's decree bring resignation, even to the extent of offering his life to the desert without grudge. There are times when he feels that it really does not matter. The desert brings out the best that is in every man. Civilization confronts the crowd with danger, and each one fights for himself and his own safety. In the desert, self becomes less and less important. Each tries to do the best he can for his comrades. Let disaster threaten a caravan, there may be one man who can see a chance to save himself, but I do not believe there is a Bedouin who would desert his comrades and so save his own life. One of the most appalling things that can happen in the desert is a shortage of water, and you would think that in such a case you would try to keep what water you have for yourself. Instead of that, you find yourself with your favorite water bottle, taking it in your arms, going around the men, asking would any of them like a drink, as nonchalantly as though there were plenty of it and to spare. The question of personal safety is eliminated. Whatever happens, let it happen to the whole caravan. You do not want to escape alone. That is the feeling that gets a hold of you. I never cease to marvel at the Bedouin's serenity and courage, which nothing disturbs. In desert travel there are three elements: camels, water supply, the guide. Camels, the best of them, and for no apparent reason, give in, as it happened when I left Kufra, and one of my best camels died on the second night, while on the other hand the weakest camel of the caravan, which left Kufra tottering under its load, went through the whole trip, about 950 miles, and arrived tottering at El Fasher. God will protect it, said its Bedouin owner, when rebuked for bringing such a sorry animal. And in truth, God did protect it. The death of a camel is a serious matter, for it means throwing away most, perhaps the whole of its load. Water is carried chiefly in sheepskins, and the best of sheepskins, tested for days and weeks beforehand, have suddenly started to leak, or the water to evaporate from them. Or in night trekking, two camels may bump together and cause one or two sheepskins to burst. And then the guide, for various reasons, may say that his head has gone round and round, which means he has lost his head. If there are clouds that hide the sun for a few hours, or one mistake in a landmark, it may cause the guide to lose his way. But there is one thing still more necessary than these three items, camels, water, guide. It is faith, profound and illimitable faith. The desert can be beautiful and kindly, and the caravan fresh and cheerful, but it can also be cruel and overwhelming, and the wretched caravan, beaten down by misfortune, staggers desperately along. It is when your camels droop their heads from thirst and exhaustion, when your water supply has run short and there is no sign of the next well, when your men are listless and without hope, when the map you carry is a blank because the desert is uncharted, when your guide, asked about the route, answers with a shrug of the shoulders that God knows best. When you scan the horizon, and all around, wherever you look, it is always the same hazy line between the pale blue of the sky and the yellow of the sand. When there is no landmark, no sign to give the slightest excuse for hope. When that immense expanse looks like, feels like a circle, drawing tighter and tighter around your parched throat, it is then that the Bedouin feels the need of a power bigger even than that ruthless desert. It is then that the Bedouin, when he has offered up his prayers to this almighty power for deliverance, and when he has offered up his prayers and they have not been granted, it is then that he draws his jerd around him, and sinking down upon the sands, awaits with outstanding equanimity the decreed death. This is the faith in which the journey across the desert must be made. The desert is terrible, and it is merciless, but to the desert all those who once have known it must return. End of section 1. Chapter 2. The Planning of the Journey. This is the story of a journey which I made in 1923 from Sollum on the Mediterranean to El Obeid in the Sudan, some 2,200 miles. In the course of it, I was fortunate enough to discover two lost oases, Arkanu and Ouenat, which previously had not been known to geographers. My journey was primarily a scientific expedition, but I have tried in this book to avoid wearying the reader with technical matters and to write a straightforward narrative which may be of some interest even to those who are not acquainted with Egypt, the Sudan, or the Libyan desert. It had always been my greatest ambition to penetrate to Kufra, a group of oases in the Libyan desert which had only once been visited by an explorer. In 1879, the intrepid German Rolfs had succeeded, but he had barely escaped with his life, and all his notebooks and the results of his scientific observations were destroyed. In 1915, I had been fortunate enough to meet in Cairo Sayyid Idris el-Senussi, the famous head of the Senussi Brotherhood, when he was returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. The capital of the Senussi is Kufra, and when in 1917 I went on a mission to Sayyid Idris with Colonel the Honorable Milo Talbot, C.B.R.E., a distinguished officer who had retired from the Egyptian army, but had returned to the service during the Great War, and renewed my acquaintance with that notable man at Zutina, a little port near Jedabia in Cyrenaica, I seized the opportunity and told him of my ambition. Sayyid Idris was most sympathetic, and asked me to let him know when I proposed to make the expedition, so that he might give me the help and countenance without which a journey to Kufra could not be undertaken. I met him again at Akrama near Tobruk, and told him then that I would set out as soon as I was free from my war duties. At Tobruk, Francis Rodd, an old Balliol friend, was with me, and we decided that we would go together. When the war was over, Mrs. Rosita Forbes, now Mrs. A. McGrath, brought me a letter of introduction from Mr. Rodd and asked that she might join us. We proceeded to plan an expedition à trois, but when the time came, Mr. Rodd was prevented from making one of the party. Finally, in 1920, Mrs. Forbes and I set out by ourselves, and with the friendly cooperation of the Italian authorities and the promised countenance and assistance of Sayed Idris, who provided us with our caravan, we reached Kufra in January 1921. But this trip to Kufra, interesting as it was, only tempted me to explore the vast unknown desert which lay beyond. There were rumors, too, of lost oases which even the people of Kufra knew only by hearsay and tradition, and I returned to Cairo, resolved to make another expedition, and instead of coming straight back from Kufra, as Mrs. Forbes and I had done, to strike south across the unknown desert until I came to Wadai and the Sudan. Again, on the first trip, our only scientific instruments were an aneroid barometer and a prismatic compass. It was not, therefore, possible for me to make exact scientific observations, and all that I brought back was notes for a simple compass traverse of the route based on the meager material I had obtained. I was eager to check Rolf's observations and to determine once and for all the place of Kufra on the map. In 1922, then, I submitted my plan for a journey across the desert from the Mediterranean to the Sudan to His Majesty King Fuad I, who had been gracious enough to display his interest in my first trip by decorating me with the Medal of Merit. He sympathized warmly with my project, directed that I should be given a long leave of absence from my official duties, and later caused the expenses of the expedition to be defrayed by the Egyptian treasury. Indeed, my expedition could not possibly have met with the success that it did, had it not been for His Majesty's invaluable support. I completed my preparations, and in December 1922 I had collected my baggage in the house of my father, so that, in accordance with the ancient practice of my race, it might be blessed before I set out on my expedition across the Libyan desert. Chapter 3. The Blessing of the Baggage. Allah Yasarad Katak, may God guide your steps. The Arabic words fell reverently on the air of the great bare room, where candlelight and clouds of drifting incense contended for supremacy. Along the walls bulked a strange collection of baggage: big boxes, little boxes, sheepskin water bags, tin fantasses for carrying water, stuffed food sacks, bales of tents, carrying cases of leather and metal containing scientific instruments, and my own personal kit. After the bustle of getting everything corded and tied and strapped and arranged in order, a hush had come as we took our stand in the middle of the room. Outside, the Egyptian night had fallen, and across the garden the faint hum of the evening life of Cairo entered our windows. We were three: myself, Abdullahi, a Nubian from Aswan, who was to be one of my most trusted men, and Ahmed, also from Aswan, looking half a wreck after a spell of city life as he stood beside us, but later to prove himself an excellent cook, and on the trek the life of the party. Before us stood a tall old man with a white flowering beard, dressed in a deep orange-colored silk kaftan. His delicately wrinkled features spoke of the peace that comes with saintliness. His long, slim fingers clicked softly against each other the amber beads of a rosary. The white smoke from the incense in the wrought silver censer, held by a servant beside him, mounted in a delicate spiral. The saintly man put aside his rosary and lifted his hands, palms upward toward heaven. His voice, thin with age but clear with conviction, sounded the prayer for those about to go upon a journey. May God guide your steps, may He crown your efforts with success, and may He return you to us safe and victorious. He went around the room, swinging the censer rhythmically before each pile of baggage and uttering little prayers. This was the traditional ceremony of blessing of the baggage, made sacred by ages of Arab usage at the setting out of a caravan. It has largely fallen into disuse in these later days, But in the house of my father, who walks through life deeply absorbed in scholarship and the faith of the prophet, it was the most natural thing in the world when the only son was going forth into the desert. As I stood before the saintly man to receive his blessing, I was no longer an Egyptian of today, but a Bedouin going back to the desert where his fathers' fathers had pitched their tents. Then I turned and I went to my father. For 15 years, since I had been sent to Europe for my education, our ways had rarely met. Sometimes I wished that I had studied the subjects in which he was interested, so that I might profit by his profound learning. "He is going to live in another generation. Let him get the education he will need for it," my father had said once of a fellow scholar of mine. But now, when I was returning to the desert from which our forefathers had come, we knew what was in each other's minds and understood. After a moment's silence, he put his hands on my shoulders and prayed, "May safety be your companion. May God guide your steps. May he give you fortitude, and may he give success to your undertakings." The baggage blessed, Abdullah and Ahmed took the heavy stuff and set out for Sollum, leaving me with the scientific instruments and the cameras for more careful handling. On December 19th, I left Alexandria by boat for Sollum. End of section 2. Chapter 4. Supplies and Equipment. The 21st found me disembarking at Sollum, which is a tiny seaport close to the western frontier of Egypt. There we were to take camel and go by way of Jagbub to Jallo, the important center of desert trade, where our own caravan would be organized and the great trek southward begun. A journey like this of mine always has several starting points, each with its own variety of emotions and experiences. In the dimly lighted, incense-scented room in my father's house, the enterprise was a kind of dream, fascinating in its possibilities, but hardly yet real. At Sollum came the practical reality of assembling stores and equipment, packing and repacking to get everything into the smallest compass and most convenient shape for handling, checking it all over to make sure that nothing had been forgotten, and arranging with camel owners for the first stage of the trip. At Jallo would come the third start, with my own caravan at my back and the road to Kufra, already traversed but by still no means familiar, before me. Then the last setting out of all as I rode out of Kufra, with my face toward the unknown and the unexplored. Abdullahi and Ahmed were already at Sollum with the heavy baggage, and the camels were arranged for, the agreement only awaiting my approval. We proceeded to get our outfit and supplies in order. Some description of the 2 Egyptians who accompanied me throughout the expedition may be of interest. Abdullahi was a Nubian from Aswan, heavily built, well set up and strong, with a pair of small eyes deeply set that could mask a malicious sense of humor with great indifference or dignity. A man of about 40, he was well educated and knew his Quran well. I met him first in 1914 when he was attached to the Idrisi family in Egypt, and I took an enormous liking to him because of his deeply rooted sense of humor and his loyalty. He was honest, too, extremely honest, and therefore I put him in charge of the commissariat. In Abdullahi's kit, one could always find anything that was needed, from strips of leather with primitive Bedouin needles for mending shoes, to elaborate contrivances for propping up a broken tent pole. He was ready, moreover, with inaccuracies to suit every situation, whether he wanted me to appear to be a wandering Bedouin from Egypt, or a merchant, or an important government official when we landed in the midst of officialdom in the Sudan. Abdullahi had one peculiarity. Between sunset and an hour or 2 later, it was apparently a most difficult task to keep him awake. Though he might be sitting down, holding a discussion, he would go on dozing as he sat. On one occasion we had just finished dinner, and, it being about the hour, Zerwali, my Bedouin loyal companion who joined our caravan at Jallo, as a joke took a lot of za'atar, a strong scent used for flavoring tea, and put it in Abdullahi's tea. In between dozes, the latter woke up, tasted his tea, knew what had happened, said nothing, but simply put back his glass. After a while, however, Abdullahi turned around and said to Zerwali, "I believe you are expecting a man to see you. I think I hear him coming." As Zerwali got up to look, Abdullahi quietly changed round the glasses, so that Zerwali drank the highly flavored tea, while Abdullahi dozed off peacefully once more. Abdullahi's business instinct came out at its best when we arrived at inhabited country toward the end of the journey, and we were short of food. He collected all the odds and ends of the caravan, including empty tins and bottles of medicine, even the few used Gillette blades, and bartered them with the natives for butter, milk, spices, and leather. It was Abdullahi also who was greatly upset when I showed my film of the expedition at a lecture given before His Majesty King Fuad at the Royal Opera House in Cairo. When Abdullahi found that he appeared in many of the pictures with a tattered shirt, he resented being shown to his king in such an unsuitable garment, and asked if something could not be done so that he should appear in a shirt that was cleaner and less well worn. Ahmed, too, was a Nubian from Aswan, a slight, wiry fellow who never gave in. He was my valet and cook. Although very well educated, he became a cook because he liked to live a free life. Had he become a religious man, as his father wished, he would have been obliged to lead a model life, and that, apparently, did not appeal to him. He was always cheerful, and though no one in the caravan did so much cursing, the Bedouins did not mind him. At a word that Ahmed said, had it come from any other, there would have been bloodshed. But the Bedouins got accustomed to him, and there was only one row. After his cooking was over, Ahmed used to sit down with the Bedouins and scorn their knowledge of religion. He would prove his superiority by reciting from memory bits of poetry about religion and the Arabic language and some of the Prophet's sayings. Never once did Ahmed fail to make me a glass of tea, even in circumstances of the greatest difficulty. On one occasion, after a whole night's trek, he was suffering badly from a hurt foot, and as we were pitching camp, I told him casually that I did not want any breakfast or tea until I had slept, and ordered him to go to bed at once. Nevertheless, just as I was getting my shelter ready, Ahmed arrived with a steaming glass of tea. He cursed all the Bedouins, but there was no Bedouin in the caravan for whom, if he felt ill, Ahmed would not do everything in his power to give him relief. He had learned gradually the use of such medicines as I had, and frequently, when in doubt, would bring me a little bottle to ask whether it was quinine or aspirin. The requirements for a desert trek are simple, and the list of what one takes with one is almost stereotyped. For food there are, first of all, flour, rice, sugar, and tea. All the people of the desert are very fond of meat, but naturally it cannot be carried. One must either shoot it by the way or go without. Tea is the drink in the Libyan desert, rather than coffee, and for that there are two reasons. The first is religious, the second is practical. Sayyid Ibn Ali al-Sanusi, the founder of that interesting brotherhood that controls the destinies of the country through which I was to travel, forbade his followers all luxuries. His prohibition included tobacco and coffee, but for some reason did not extend to tea. His followers, therefore, are tea drinkers, if you can call by the same name the delicate aromatic pale fluid that graces the tea tables of Europe and America, and the murky, bitter liquid which sustains the Bedouin on his marches and revives him at day's end. The second reason is that tea is a stimulant to work on, while coffee is not. Tea is the thing with which to finish off each meal of the desert day and to refresh the weary traveler at the end of a hard day's trek, leaving coffee for the less strenuous life of the oasis and the home. After these staples come dates, or perhaps they ought to be put first. The camels live on dates, as does the whole caravan when other foods are exhausted, or when there is no time to halt and cook a meal. But the dates are not the rich, sweet, sugary things one is accustomed to for dessert or a picnic delicacy in Western lands. The date which one must use for desert travel has little sugar about it. Sugar breeds thirst, and where wells are days apart, The water supply is not to be prodigally spent. I took some tinned things with me, bully beef, vegetables, and fruits, but tins are heavy, and to carry enough food in tins for a long trek would demand a score of extra camels or more. There was a little coffee in our stores, but we seldom drank it. I used most of it for presents to the friends we made along the way. A few bottles of malted milk tablets proved useful as emergency lunches when food ran low. The Bedouins, however, were not keen on them. "They fill us up," they said, "without the pleasure of the taste." That was our commissary list, except for salt and some spices, especially pepper for the asida, a pudding of boiled flour and oil made pepper hot. There was little variety, but variety is the one thing one has to give up when one's supplies are to be carried by animals who must themselves live cheaply on what they can carry. There were no luxuries, no matter how pleasant they might have been to relieve the monotony of rice, unleavened bread, dates, and tea. If one has experience in desert travel and the wisdom to learn by it, one takes no foods of which there is not enough to feed everyone in the caravan. On the trek in the desert, there is no distinction of rank or class, high or low. The sole exception to the rule of no luxuries was tobacco. Since only one of my men who were with me at any time on the trip smoked, however, this was no real violation of the rule. A stock of Egyptian cigarettes and tobacco afforded me constant pleasure and comfort throughout the journey. Next comes water, the one great and unceasing problem of desert travel. Men have lived for an unbelievable number of days without food, whether from necessity or from curiosity, but the man who could go for 4 days without water would be a miracle. A desert is a desert just because it lacks water. The desert traveler must think first of his drinking supply. We carried water in 2 ways. The regular supply was held in 25 girbas, the traditional sheepskin water carrier of the desert. Each holds from 4 to 6 gallons and is easily burst if 2 camels carrying girbas bump together in the dark on a rocky road. So the reserve water supply for emergencies is carried in fantasses. They are long tin containers, oblong or oval-shaped in cross-section, to hang easily along the camel's side. We had 4 fantasses holding 4 gallons each, and 4 others holding 12 gallons each. Our full supply, therefore, was something like 200 gallons, enough to last our caravan, when it was finally organized, on the longest trek from well to well that we were likely to encounter. We carried only our reserve supply in fantasses, although they were less liable to injury because the girbas, when empty, took up so little space. All 25 of them could be carried on 1 camel, while only 2 fantasses went to a camel, full or empty. We had no camels to spare. There were also some individual water bottles, but most of them were soon discarded because the men hated the nuisance of carrying them. A few were kept for cooling water later on in the journey when the weather became hot. The evaporation of the moisture through the canvas sides of the bottles or bags kept the water within at a pleasant temperature. 4 tents, 2 bell-shaped and 2 rectangular, and numerous cooking utensils, of which the chief was a huge brass challah, or bowl for boiling rice, made up the tail of our equipment. For emergencies there was a medicine chest with quinine, iodine, cotton, and bandages, bismuth salicylate for dysentery, morphine tablets in a hypodermic syringe, anti-scorpion serum, which was to plunge me into an apparently serious predicament and rescue me from it, zinc ointment for eczema, indigestion tablets, and Epsom salts. I had a primitive surgical kit and a few dental instruments and remedies which a dentist friend had given me. I was equipped to take care of the simple everyday ills. If anything more serious befell, I should have to say, recovery comes from God. For hunting and possible defense, I took 3 rifles, 3 automatic pistols, and a shotgun. By the time of our return, the shotgun had been given as a present, and the rest of the arsenal had been increased by 6 rifles and 1 pistol. When the rifles arrived at Sollum in their characteristically shaped boxes, it was immediately rumored through the town that I was carrying a machine gun, for some mysterious purpose which gossip elaborated to suit itself. In order to make the report of what I found and saw as vivid and truthful as possible, I took 5 cameras. 3 of them were Kodaks, which functioned perfectly to the end. 1, a more elaborate instrument with a focal plane shutter, which was ruined by the penetrating sand, and the last a cinema machine. For all the cameras I carried Eastman Kodak films, which were packed with elaborate care, first in airtight tins, then in tin cases, sawdust-filled, and finally in wooden boxes. These precautions in packing proved to be none too great in view of the intense heat of the first part of the route and the rain and dampness which we encountered later on in the Sudan. For the cinema camera I took 9,000 feet of film. Fortune was with me in all the photographic work. The films were not developed until my return 8 months later to Egypt, but the percentage of failures was gratifyingly low. For clothing, I took the usual Bedouin garb of white shirts and long drawers, both made of calico, and a woolen jerd, the voluminous Bedouin wrap. Also silk jackets and waistcoats and cloth drawers, like riding breeches but reaching to the ankles. The latter were used only on ceremonious occasions, such as entering or leaving an oasis. There were naturally a few changes of each. I did not wish to put on the desert dress until the end of the first stage of the journey, so I left Solemn in an old khaki coat and riding breeches, which had already seen their best days. With yellow Bedouin slippers on my feet, the only possible wear in desert travel, and a Jaeger woolen nightcap on my head, for the weather was keenly cold, I must have been an amusing figure when we made our start. When traveling into unknown lands, especially in the East, it is important to be able to make presents to those of prominence whom you meet. I had what seemed to me an enormous supply of silks, copper bowls, and censers inlaid with silver, bottles of scent, silk handkerchiefs, silver teapots and tea glasses, silver call bells, which the Bedouin is delighted to be able to use for summoning his slaves instead of the usual clapping of the hands. When I saw all this array being packed, I felt sure we should bring back half of it with us. But by the time we had reached Kufra, I discovered that not only those who were of use to me this time, but everyone who had rendered the slightest service on my previous trip was expectant of a reward for services rendered. What with postponed expectations and the opportunities which the present trip afforded me for making presents, we had none too many of the goods I have mentioned. In making these gifts, however, I did not feel that it was so much an endeavor to smooth the way of my expedition as a courtesy from a Bedouin of the town to his brother Bedouin of the desert. Most important of all for the ultimate value of the expedition, if it was to have any, was the scientific apparatus, which is detailed in Dr. Ball's report in the appendix. The fortnight at Solemn was filled with busy days. Simple as our equipment was, everything had to be as nearly right as thought and care could achieve. Things carried on camelback, put on each morning and taken off each night, and built into barricades against the weather and possible attacks, must be snugly and securely packed. At the end of a day's trek, careless or tired camelmen often find it easier to let boxes and bundles drop without ceremony from the camel sides than to handle them with proper care. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Plots and Omens. My plans were all made for a trek straight south to Jagbub, when, 2 days before the date determined upon for the start, an incident happened which disquieted me. I was sitting one evening in my room in the little government rest house, busy with the figures of my scientific observations. There came a knock at the door. I could not imagine who would want me at that hour, but I went to the door and opened it a little way. A Bedouin whom I did not know was standing there, muffled Bedouin fashion in his jerd. I shut the door quickly and demanded, "Who are you?" "A friend," was the answer, which somehow did not convince me. "What is your name and business?" I asked. "I am a friend, and I have something to tell you which you ought to know," explained my visitor through the closed door. I opened the door and demanded what he had to tell. He came in. "You are going by the straight road to Jagbub?" he half queried. I nodded assent. "Don't go," he continued with vigor. "Why not?" I asked. "The Bey is a rich man," he said. "He carries with him great stores of the bounty of God, and the Bedouins are greedy. The rumor is that you have many boxes of gold." I could see that he half believed it, though he was pretending not to. "The camel men have agreed with friends on the road that you should be waylaid and robbed. You will lose your money and probably your life." "One can always fight," I suggested. "Perhaps," he agreed, "if you had plenty of men of your own." I hadn't, so I proceeded to question him further about his information. The story seemed straight enough, and when I learned that my visitor was a relative of a man to whom I had done a good turn when on the last mission to the Senussis, I felt that it would be wise to believe him. I thanked him for his warning, and he went away into the night. I sat down to consider the unpleasantly melodramatic situation. The desert people are quick to ferret out your purpose if they can, and if they cannot, to build up imaginary stories to account for what you are and have and intend to do. Much of our paraphernalia was in boxes. Boxes, to the Bedouin mind, mean treasure. If 3 rifles in a case could be translated into a machine gun, why should not the cameras and instruments in boxes be translated into gold and banknotes? It was no wonder that the men whose camels we had hired were convinced that I was going into the desert with a vast wealth for some unknown purpose. It was quite possible that they planned to rob me. It was a cheerful outlook for the very beginning of our journey. A fight, no matter how successful, would be a poor start for our undertaking. I decided that it would be better to avoid this first obstacle in our path rather than to encounter it. Promptly the next day, the camel owners whose pleasant little plan had been revealed to me found themselves discharged. Others, with their camels, were forthwith hired to take me to Siwa. Instead of the straight line to Jagbub, we would go along the 2 other sides of the triangle, whose apexes were Sollum, Siwa, and Jagbub. It would materially lengthen the first part of our journey, but, after all, time and distance were less important than safe arrival. The road by way of Siwa had several advantages. It lay in Egyptian territory, and not in the country inhabited by the tribes to which the first set of camelmen belonged. In the second place, it ran through more frequented territory, where a treacherous waylaying of our caravan would have been more perilous to the waylayers. Lastly, our quick departure after the change of plan gave the conspirators no time to develop any new plot if they had wanted to. It looked safe, and it proved to be as safe as it looked. On January 1st, the caravan started, and 3 days later Lieutenant Bather very kindly took me in a motor car to catch up with it. We found the caravan at Dignesh, 36 miles out, and saying goodbye to the lieutenant, I took up the journey. It was then a 6 days' trek to Siwa. Our spare time was profitably spent in camouflaging the boxes and cases in our luggage to look like the usual Bedouin impedimenta. The only event of interest during the 6 days was the first of 3 good omens that foretold success to the trip. On the 5th day, in the late afternoon, I saw a gazelle feeding a little distance off our track. Without other thought than the pleasant anticipation of fresh meat, I set out after it. As I went, I heard discouraging shouts and howls from the men behind me. I could not understand their reluctance to have me go after the game, in view of the Bedouins' love of meat. I imagined that they were afraid I would be led away some distance from them, and thus hold up the progress of the caravan. The reason did not seem quite sufficient, so I pursued my quest. After some chase, I got a shot at the gazelle and brought it down. As I approached the caravan with my game, I was surprised again. The men came running toward me with waving arms and shouts of joyful congratulations. I understood their present state of mind no more than I had their former one, until the explanation was forthcoming. Then I learned that among the Bedouins The first shot fired at game after a caravan sets out is the critical one. If it is a miss, disaster is certain to overtake the caravan before the journey's end. If it is a hit, fortune will smile upon the whole undertaking. The men of the caravan had been reluctant to see me put our luck to the test so soon. If I had remembered the Bedouin travel lore, I should have saved my first shot at game until we reached El Fasher 6 months later. We were 3 days in Siwa, hiring other camels for the trek to Jagbub and making few final preparations. Siwa was the last outpost of the world I was leaving behind. There the postal service and the telegraph end. Beyond that point, there is nothing to be bought except the products of the desert, or occasionally a little rice or cloth, perhaps at exorbitant prices. In my 3 days I enjoyed the hospitality and valuable assistance of the Frontier District's administration in the persons of the Mamour and town officials and of Lieutenant Lawler in command of the troops there. Siwa is the biggest and most charming of oases. Springs of wonderful water, excellent fruit, the best dates in the world, picturesque scenery, and the quaintest and most interesting of customs. For example, if a woman loses her husband, she is kept 40 days without washing, and nobody sees her. Her food is passed through a crack in the door. When the 40 days have expired, she goes to bathe in one of the wells, and everybody tries to avoid crossing her path, for she is then called Gula, and is supposed to bring very bad luck to anybody who sees her on that day of that first bath. In the date market, called the Mista, all the dates are piled together, the best quality and the most inferior. No one thinks of touching one date that does not belong to him, or mixing the dates together with a view to gaining an advantage thereby. On the other hand, anybody can go into a Mista and eat as much as he likes from the best quality without paying a million, but he must not take any away with him. In Siwa, there is a shrine of a saint where people may deposit their belongings for safety. If a man is going away, he can take his bags with the most valuable things and put them near this shrine, and nobody would dream of touching them. Literally, if anyone left a bundle of gold there, no one would touch it, because of the very simple but unshakable belief in them that if you touch anything near that shrine and it does not belong to you, you would have bad luck for the rest of your life. When I was ready to leave Siwa, my little group of personal retainers had doubled in number. At Sollum, I added to Abdullahi and Ahmed a man of the Monafa tribe named Hamad. He was the hardest working individual in the entire caravan. I never saw him tired. He took charge of my camel and later of the horse, which I secured at Kufra. The fourth member of the group was Ismail, a Siwi. He looked like a weakling, but on the trek he was always the last man to give in and ride a camel. Ismail was the one whom I used to take with me when prospecting for geological specimens or making elaborate scientific observations. Coming from an oasis in Egyptian territory where the post and the telegraph made connection with the outside world, he had less of the wild Bedouin suspicion that interprets every simple action of the stranger into something with an ulterior motive. Why should the Bey be chipping off bits of rock, the Bedouin might say to himself, unless there were gold in it, or he intended to come and conquer the country? Not so Ismail. If the Bey wanted a bit of rock, that was for the Bey to say. We left Siwa on the 14th with our new caravan. Our last link with the outside world was broken. At the first stop I took off my faded khaki and put on the Bedouin costume, and felt myself now a part of the desert life. The effect upon the men was immediate. Till now they had approached me with embarrassment and awkwardness. Now they came up naturally, kissed my hand in Bedouin fashion, and said, "Now you are one of us." Our second good omen befell us a few miles out of Siwa. We found dates in our path where some unfortunate date merchant, taking his cargo to market, had had an accident. Dates in the way are a promise of good fortune for the journey. Often when a Bedouin is setting out with his caravan, friends will secretly go ahead and drop dates where he will be sure to pass them. With my first shot and the gazelle and the dates in the path, We had every reason to be cheerful. But the best omen of all was to come. I had sent 2 men ahead with a letter to Sayed Idris at Jagbug to inform him of my approach. In the desert, one does not rush upon a friend or a dignitary headlong and unannounced. There should be time for both to put on fresh clothing and go with dignity to the meeting as becomes gentlemen of breeding. 2 days out from Siwa, I was riding some distance behind the caravan and presently came upon it halted. I asked the reason for the unusual stop and received the reply, "Messengers have come to say that Sayed Idris will be here within the hour." The men could scarcely conceal their excitement. To be met by the great head of the Senussis himself at the beginning of our journey was the most auspicious of omens. The rest of the message was indicative of the etiquette of the desert. He asked the Bey to camp so that he may come to him. We immediately made camp, and before long the vanguard of Sayed Idris's caravan appeared and made a camp in their turn a short distance away. A half hour later Sayed Idris himself with his retinue advanced toward my camp, and I went to meet him. Sayed Idris met me with warm cordiality, and we renewed the acquaintance made on our previous meetings with deep gratification on my part and apparent pleasure on his. The former trip could never have been successful without the countenance he gave to it and the assistance he rendered. How much more the present one, which was to take me 3 times as far and into more completely unknown regions. In his tent we lunched on rice, stuffed chicken, and sweet Bedouin cakes, followed by glasses of tea delicately scented with mint and rosewater. I told him of my plans and gave him news of the outside world. He was interested to know the final issue of the peace conference at Versailles. At his suggestion, I brought all the men of my caravan to his tent to receive his blessing. As I stood with them and heard the familiar words fall from his lips, there came irresistibly to my mind that moment in the incense-shrouded room in Cairo and my father's blessing upon my undertaking. Then my imagination had leaped out to meet the vision of the desert, the camels, and Bedouin life. Now the need for imagination was gone. I was in Bedouin kit, with the camels of my caravan behind me, and the road to the goal I sought stretching ahead. To my men, the experience of being blessed by Sayed Idris himself was the greatest augury of success that we could have had. Nothing could harm us now. In the afternoon we said farewell. Both camps were broken, and both caravans took up the march, Sayed Idris going east into Egypt, and I west to Jagbub and the long trail into the desert. As we marched, my men insisted on following the track made by the caravan of Sayed Idris to prolong the great good fortune that had befallen us. End of section 4. Chapter 6. The Senussis. Any story of the Libyan desert would not be complete without some consideration of the Senussis, the most important influence in that region. The subject is a complicated one. Justice might be done to it if an entire volume were available, but within the limits of a chapter only the important points of Senussi history can be touched. The Senussis are not a race, nor a country, nor a political entity, nor a religion. They have, however, some of the characteristics of all 4. In fact, they are almost exclusively Bedouins. They inhabit, for the most part, the Libyan desert. They exert a controlling influence over considerable areas of that region and are recognized by the governments of surrounding territory as a real power in the affairs of northeastern Africa. And they are Muslims. Perhaps the best short description of the Senussis would be as a religious order whose leadership is hereditary and which exerts a predominating influence in the lives of the people of the Libyan desert. The history of the Brotherhood may be roughly divided into 4 periods. In each, it took its color from the personality of the leader. These were, respectively, Sayyid Ibn Ali al-Senussi, the founder, Sayyid al-Mahdi, his son, Sayyid Ahmad, the nephew of the latter, and Sayyid Idris, the son of al-Mahdi, the present head of the Brotherhood. Sayyid Muhammad ibn Ali al-Sanusi, known as the Grand Sanusi, was born in Algeria in the year 1202 after the Hejra, which corresponds to 1787 in the Christian calendar. He was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and had received an unusually scholarly education in the Kairouan University in Fez and at Mecca, where he became the pupil of the famous theologian Sidi Ahmed ibn Idris el-Fazi. He developed an inclination to asceticism and a conviction that what his religion needed was a return to a pure form of Islam as exemplified in the teachings of the Prophet. At the age of 51, he was compelled to leave Mecca by the opposition of the older sheiks who challenged his orthodoxy. He returned through Egypt to Cyrenaica and began to establish centers for teaching his doctrines among the Bedouins. At this point, an explanation of the meaning of 3 Arabic words will elucidate the text. They are Zawiya, Ikhwan, and Wakil. A Zawiya is a building of 3 rooms, its size depending on the importance of the place in which it is situated. One room is a schoolroom in which the Bedouin children are taught by the Ikhwan. The second serves as a guest house in which travelers receive the usual 3 days' hospitality of Bedouin custom. In the third, the Ikhwan lives. The Zawiya is generally built near a well where travelers naturally stop. Attached to the Zawiya is often a bit of land which is cultivated by the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan are the active members of the Brotherhood who teach its principles and precepts. Ikhwan in Arabic is really a plural form, which means brothers. But the singular of the word is never used, Ikhwan having come to be used for one or more. A wakil is the personal representative or deputy of the head of the Sanusis. The Grand Sanusi found the Moslems of Cyrenaica fallen into heresies and in danger of rapid degeneration, not only from a religious but from a moral point of view. Some small examples may serve to illustrate this point. At Jebel Akhdar in the north of Cyrenaica, certain influential Bedouin chiefs had established a sort of a Kaaba, an imitation of the true one at Mecca, to which every believer who could possibly do so should make his pilgrimage. These founders of a false Kaaba tried to establish the theory that a pilgrimage thither was a worthy substitute for the Hajj, the authentic pilgrimage to the central shrine of Islam. The keeping of the month of Ramadan as a time of abstinence and religious contemplation is an important tenet to the Moslem faith. The Bedouins used to go before the beginning of Ramadan to a certain valley called Wadi Zaza, noted for the multiple echo given back by its walls. In chorus, they would shout a question, Wadi Zaza, shall we keep Ramadan or no? The echo, of course, threw back the last words of the question, no, no, no. Those who had appealed thus to the oracle would then go home, justified in their own minds in the desire to forego the keeping of the fast. There were also prevalent among the Bedouins remnants of old barbaric customs, such as the killing of female children to save them from the evils which life might bring, which stood between them and their development into worthy exponents of Islam. In such circumstances, what the founder of the Sanusi Brotherhood had to give in his teaching and preaching of a return to the pure tenets of Islam met a poignant need. Sayyid Ibn Ali al-Sanusi founded his first Zawiya on African soil at Siwa, which is in Egypt close to the western frontier. From that point he moved westward into Cyrenaica, establishing Zawiyas at Jallo and Ujila. He traveled westward through Tripoli and Tunis, gradually spreading his teachings among the Bedouins. His reputation as a saintly man and as a scholar had preceded him, and he was much sought after by the Bedouin chiefs, who vied with one another to give him hospitality. On his return to Cyrenaica in the year 1843, he established at Jebel Akhdar near Derna a large Zawiya called El Zawiya El Beta, the White Zawiya. Until this time he had no headquarters, but led a life of a wandering teacher. He settled down at El Zawiya El Beta and received visits from the leading Bedouin dignitaries of Cyrenaica. The Grand Sanusi preached a pure form of Islam and strict adherence to the laws of God and his prophet Muhammad. His teachings may perhaps be best illustrated by a passage from a letter to the people of Wajanga in Wadai, the original of which I saw at Kufra and translated. The passage reads as follows: "We wish to ask you in the name of Islam to obey God and his prophet. In his dear book he says, 'Praise be to him, O ye who are believers, obey God and obey the prophet.' He also says he obeys the prophet has also obeyed God. He also says he who obeys God and his prophet has won a great victory. He also says those who obey God and the prophet, they are with the prophets whom God has rewarded. We wish to ask you to obey what God and his prophet have ordered, making the 5 prayers every day, keeping the month of Ramadan, giving tithes, making the Hajj to the sacred home of God, and avoiding what God has forbidden, telling lies, slandering people behind their backs, taking unlawfully other people's money, drinking wine, killing men unlawfully, bearing false witness, and the other crimes before God. In following these, you will gain everlasting good and endless benefits which can never be taken from you." The principal concern of the founder of the Sanusis was with the religious aspects of life. He did not set out to be a political leader or to grasp temporal power. He counseled austerity of life with the same enthusiasm with which he practiced it. He taught no special theological doctrines and demanded acceptance of no particular dogmas. He cared much more for what his followers did than for any technicalities of belief. His only addition to the Moslem ritual was a single prayer, which he wrote and which the Sanusis use, called the Hezb. It is not opposed to anything taught by the older theologians, nor does it add anything to what is found in the Quran. It is simply expressed in a different language. In the letter to the people of Wajanga, which I have quoted, another passage describing his mission which God had laid upon him as that of reminding the negligent, teaching the ignorant, and guiding him who has gone astray. He forbade all kinds of luxurious living to those who allied themselves with his brotherhood. The possession of gold and jewels was prohibited, except for the adornment of women, and the use of tobacco and coffee. He imposed no ritual and only demanded a return to the simplest form of Islam as it was found in the teaching of the Prophet. He was intolerant of any intercourse, not only with Christians and Jews, but with that part of the Moslem world which, in his conviction, had digressed from the original meaning of Islam. In the year 1856, Sayyid Ibn Ali founded at Jegbug the Zawiya which eventually developed into the center of education and learning of the Sanusi Brotherhood. His choice of Jegbug was not haphazard or accidental, but a demonstration of his wisdom and practical sagacity. He conceived it to be of first importance to reconcile the different tribes of the desert to each other and to bring peace among them. One more quotation from his letter illustrates this point. "We intend to make peace between you and the Arabs," the people of Wajanga to whom this letter is addressed are of the black race, "who invade your territory and take your sons as slaves and your money. In so doing, we shall be carrying out the injunction of God, who has said, 'If 2 parties of believers come into conflict, make peace between them.' Also, we shall be following his direction, 'Fear God, make peace among those about you, and obey God and his prophet, if you are believers.'" Jegbub was a strategic point for his purpose. It stood midway between tribes on the east and on the west who had been in constantly recurring conflict. With his headquarters there, the Grand Sanusi could bring his influence to bear on the warring rivals and carry out the command of the prophet to make peace among those about you. From a practical standpoint, Jegbub was an unpromising place in which to set up such a center of educational and religious activity as the Grand Sanusi had in contemplation. It is not much of an oasis, if indeed it can be called an oasis at all. Date trees are scarce there, the water is brackish, and the soil is very difficult to cultivate. Its strategic importance, however, was clear, and without hesitation he selected it as the site of his headquarters. The raids made upon each other by the tribes to the east and the west were brought to an end through his influence. He settled many old feuds, not only between those tribes, but among the other tribes in Cyrenaica. Sayyid Ibn Ali lived for 6 years after establishing himself at Jagbug, and extended his influence far and wide. The Zuwaya tribe, who had been known as the brigands of Cyrenaica, fearing neither God nor man, invited him to come to Kufra, the chief community of their people, and establish a Zawiya there. They agreed to give up raiding and thieving and attacking other tribes, and offered him 1/3 of all their property in Kufra if he would come to them. He could not go in person, but he sent the famous Ikhwan Sidi Omar Buhawa, who established the first Sanusi Zawiya at Jaf in Kufra, and began the dissemination of the teachings of the Grand Sanusi among the Zawiyans. Sayyid Ibn Ali also commissioned Ikhwan to go into many other parts of the Libyan desert, and before his death all the Bedouins on the western frontier of Egypt and all over Cyrenaica had become his disciples. He died in the year 1859, and was buried in the tomb over which rises the Kuba of Jagbub. The Grand Sanusi was succeeded by his son, Sidi Muhammad el-Mahdi, who was 16 years old when his father died. In spite of his youth, his succession as head of the order was strengthened by 2 circumstances. It was remembered that on one occasion, at the end of an interview with his father, el-Mahdi was about to leave the room when the Grand Sanusi rose and performed for him the menial service of arranging his slippers, which had been taken off on entering. The founder of the order addressed all those present in these words: "Witness, O ye men here present, how Ibn Ali el-Sanusi arranges the slippers of his son el-Mahdi." It was realized that he meant to indicate that the son not only would succeed the father, but would surpass him in holiness and sanctity. Then, too, there was an ancient prophecy that the Mahdi, who would reconquer the world for Islam, would attain his majority on the first day of Muharram in the year 1300 after the Hijra, having been born of parents named Muhammad and Fatma, and having spent several years in seclusion. Each part of this prophecy was fulfilled in the person of el-Mahdi. The choice as successor to the Grand Sanusi fell upon him. When Sayyid el-Mahdi reached his majority, there were 38 Zawiyas in Cyrenaica and 18 in Tripolitania. Others were scattered over other parts of North Africa, and there were nearly a score in Egypt. It has been estimated that between 1.5 million and 3 million people owed spiritual allegiance to the head of the Brotherhood when el-Mahdi became its active head. He was the most illustrious of the Sanusi family. He saw from the first that there was more scope for the influence of the Brotherhood in the direction of Kufra and the regions to the southward than in the north. In the year 1894, he removed his headquarters from Jagbub to Kufra. Before his departure, he freed all his slaves, and some of them and their children are still to be found living at Jagbub. His going to Kufra marked the beginning of an important era in the history of the Sanusis, and also in the development of trade between the Sudan and the Mediterranean coast by way of Kufra. The difficult and waterless trek between Boutefal Well near Jallo and Zigan Well just north of Kufra became in el-Mahdi's time a beaten route continually frequented by trade caravans and by travelers going to visit the center of the Sanusi Brotherhood. A man could walk for half a day from one end of the caravan to the other, a Bedouin told me. The route from Kufra south to Wadai was also a hard and dangerous journey in those days, and el-Mahdi caused the 2 wells of Bishra and Sarah to be dug on the road from Kufra to Tekro. Under the rule of the Zuwaya tribe of Bedouins, who had conquered Kufra from the Black Tabus, that group of oases was the chief center of brigandage in the Libyan desert. The Zuwayas are a warlike tribe, and in the days before the coming of the Sanusis, they were a law unto themselves and a menace to all those who passed through their territory. Each caravan going through Kufra, north or south, was either pillaged or, if lucky, was compelled to pay a route tax to the Zuwayas. These masters of Kufra were induced by al-Mahdi to give up this exacting of tribute. He realized the importance of developing the trade of the oases and of the routes across the Libyan desert from the north to the south. He strove to make desert travel safe, and in his day, Bu Matare, a Zawiya chieftain, told me at Kufra a woman might travel from Barca, Cyrenaica, to Wadai unmolested. El-Mahdi also extended the circle of influence of the Senussis in many directions. Ikhwan were set out to establish Zawiyas from Morocco as far east as Persia. But his greatest work was in the desert, among the Bedouins and the black tribes south of Kufra. He made the Senussis not only a spiritual power in those regions and a powerful influence for peace and amity among the tribes, but a strong mercantile organization under whose stimulus trade developed and flourished. In the last years of his life, he undertook to extend the influence of the Brotherhood to the southward in person. He had gone to Jero, south of Kufra, when his death came suddenly in the year 1900. The sons of el-Mahdi were then minors, and his nephew Sayyid Ahmad was made head of the Brotherhood. He was the guardian of Sayyid Idris, who, as the eldest son of el-Mahdi, was his legitimate successor. The new head of the Senussis made an abrupt departure from the policies of his predecessors. He sought to combine temporal and spiritual power. When the Italians took over Cyrenaica and Tripoli from the Turks, Sayyid Ahmad attempted to unite his spiritual power as head of the Brotherhood with the remnants of temporal and military power left by the Turks. Then the Great War broke out, and he allowed himself to be persuaded by Turkish and German emissaries to attack the western frontier of Egypt. The effort was a complete failure, and Sayyid Ahmad was compelled to go to Constantinople in a German submarine. The third of the Senussi leaders saw things differently from the Grand Senussi and his son. They had realized that a spiritual leader cannot be beaten on his own ground, whereas if he takes the field in quest of temporal supremacy, it requires only a few military reverses to destroy his prestige. The power of Sayyid ibn Ali el-Senussi and Sayyid el-Mahdi lay in themselves and in the spiritual influence that radiated from them. Sayyid Ahmad surrendered this influence to rely upon arms, ammunition, and circumstances. When these failed, there was nothing left. From the hands of Sayyid Ahmad, the Senussi leadership fell to the lineal successor, Sayyid Idris. He derives a considerable part of the prestige which he undoubtedly possesses from the fact that he is the son of el-Mahdi. But even without that advantage, his own personal qualities would be an adequate foundation for success in the important position to which he has been called. He combines gentleness of disposition with firmness of character to a high degree. He has the loyal allegiance and support not only of the Senussi Ikhwan, but of the people of the Libyan desert. In 1917, an agreement was entered into by the Italian government with Sayyid Idris as head of the Senussi Brotherhood, by which his right to administer the affairs of the oases of Jallo, Aujila, Jedabiyah, and Kufra was expressly recognized. This agreement was again ratified 2 years later at Rajima. Unfortunately, in 1923, a misunderstanding between the parties to this agreement caused it to lapse. It is to be hoped, however, that a new arrangement will be entered into between Sayyid Idris and the Italian authorities, which will restore to these oases of the Libyan desert their peace and prosperity. There can be no question that the influence of the Senussi Brotherhood upon the lives of the people in that region is good. The Ikhwan of the Senussis are not only the teachers of the people, both in the field of religion and of general knowledge, but judges and intermediaries between man and between tribe and tribe. The letter to the people of Wajanga already quoted clearly illustrates how the Grand Senussi laid down this office of peacemaking as the duty of the Senussi brothers. It was developed and made even more important by his great son, el-Mahdi. The importance of these aspects of the Senussi rule in maintaining the tranquility and well-being of the people of the Libyan desert can scarcely be overestimated. End of section 5. Chapter 7. The Peace of Jagbub. On the afternoon of the second day after meeting with Sayyid Idris, we saw the snow-white kubba, or dome, of the mosque at Jagbub rising before us. In proper Bedouin fashion, we camped a short distance from the town and sent a messenger ahead to announce our arrival. 2 hours later, he returned to say that they were ready to receive us. The caravan went forward, and as it approached the walls, we fired our rifles in the air. We were met at the gate by Sidi Hussain, the wakil, or representative of Sayyid Idris in the town, accompanied by a group of Ikhwan, who are teachers in the school. The students lined up along the way and gave a cheer as we went through. The warmth of the welcome aroused an echo in our hearts. Entering Jagbub was, to me, like coming home. 2 years before, it had been close to the finish of our journey. Now it stood as a starting point, one of several, it is true, but still a starting point on the greater journey that was to come. The first time at Jagbub had been marked by the reaction that comes when the long trek is over. Now I was expectant and excited. Journey's end and trek's beginning are both great moments, but the emotions they arouse are not the same. I was impatient to start again, but 1 month and 4 days were to pass before I took the road, for there were no camels waiting for me. Before leaving Sollum, I had sent a man, Sayyid Ali el-Siate, by the direct route to Jagbub to hire camels and have them waiting when I should arrive over the longer route by way of Siwa. But Ali had apparently vanished into thin air. He had gone as far as Jedabiyah, I learned, without success, for none of the Bedouins on the way from Sollum would let him have the beasts I wanted. At Jedabiyah, too, he had found no camels available. I waited 2 weeks with no sign of Ali. Then I discovered that the reason he could get no camels was because the road from Jagbub to Jallo was used exclusively by Bedouins of the Zawiya and Majabra tribes, and no other Bedouins dared to venture upon it. Though I was eager to get going again, I could not resist the charm and peace of the place in which I found myself immured. Jagbub is the center of education and religion. There is no trade here, and no cultivation of the soil, except for some small bits of oases where former slaves, who had been freed by Sayyid el-Mahdi when he moved to Kufra, grew vegetables and a few dates. The life of the town centers about the mosque, which is large enough to hold 500 or 600 persons, and the school, which is the center of religious education for the Sunusis. Near the mosque are a few houses belonging to the Sunusi family and the Ikhwan, and scattered about, both within and without the walls, are a number of private houses. Buildings with rooms for some 200 or 300 students are also grouped near the mosque. Jagbub had reached the height of its importance when Sayyid Ibn Ali, the Grand Sunusi, made it the center of the Brotherhood. When his son, Sayyid el-Mahdi, succeeded him, the importance of the town continued for about a dozen years, until he transferred the center of the Brotherhood's activities to Kufra. Then, when Sayyid Ahmad el-Sarif, as guardian of a young Sayyid Idris, was in control, Jagbub again flourished as the capital. Its importance has fluctuated through the years with the presence or absence of the heads of the family within its walls. If Sayyid Idris were to make it again the seat of the Sunusi rule, in 2 months the school and the town would be overflowing with members of the Brotherhood, with students, and with pious visitors to the shrine of the Grand Sunusi. But at the time of my visit there were only 80 young Bedouins from 8 to 15 years of age studying under the Ikhwan. If there had been more teachers, there would have been more students. But at the time of our visit, the head of the Sunusi family, whom we had met on his way to Egypt, had his headquarters in Jedabiyah, far to the westward. In an inner room of the mosque, a beautifully wrought cage of brass encloses the tomb where lies the body of that great man who sought for his people a pure, austere, and rigidly simple form of Islam, untainted by contact with the outside world. To this shrine, every adherent to the Brotherhood who can accomplish the journey comes to pay homage and to renew his vows. The students of the school come to Jagbub with one of two purposes, either to fit themselves to become Ikhwan, the brothers of the fraternity, or simply to go back to their homes in the oases educated men with a right to spiritual leadership in their communities. Except for the annoying problem of getting camels to take my expedition to Jallo, about 350 kilometers away to the westward, my life in Jagbub was one of peaceful reflection and preparation for the undertaking before me. The desert demands and induces a quite different attitude of mind and of spirit from the bustling life of the city. As I wandered about the little town and out into the oasis around it, or stood in the cool, shadowed spaces of the mosque, or sat at times in the tower above it in conversation with learned Bedouins, watching the night fall over the milk-white Kuba and the brown mass of buildings it dominates, there dropped away from me all the worries and perplexities and problems that the sophisticated life of crowded places brings in its train. Day after day passed, with a morning's walk, midday prayers in the mosque, a quiet meal, a little work with my instruments or cameras, afternoon prayers, another walk, a meal, followed by the distribution to my men of friendly glasses of tea according to Bedouin custom. Again prayers, and, after quiet contemplation of the evening sky with its peaceful stars, retirement to sleep, such as the harassed city dweller does not know. Among all the Ikhwan whom I met and talked with at Jagbub, there was one who particularly interested me, for he would neither sit and talk with me himself, nor could I learn from his brother Ikhwan the reason for his strange aloofness. At length, by chance, I learned the story of Sidi Aben Bu Gemira. Sidi Adam is a withered old man with a refined, proud face and a bitter twist to his mouth. Life has not been kind to him in his old age. On my first visit to Jagbub, I stayed at his empty house for 3 days. I had no chance then of a long conversation with him. This time he came to see me on the evening of my arrival to welcome me back to Jagbub. I felt that a tragedy lay behind this old man. He is one of the Barasa tribe, one of the elite among the Bedouins, and he is as proud as any of them. Yet he does not accept his fate, and for some time I wondered how it was that he, a Bedouin, had not learned to do so. All around me at Jagbub were types of benevolent humanity. Sidi Adam alone stood out distinct from his brethren, a tragic picture of beaten pride. Late one evening, as I was coming back from the mosque after prayers, I found Mabruk, an old slave of Sidi el-Mahdi's. "Peace be on you and the blessings of God," I greeted him. "And on you, my master, and God's mercy and blessing," he replied. I sat down with him, and we began talking about the little patch of cultivation to which he was attending. "Eh," he exclaimed, "we have not much food, but by the blessings of Sidi el-Mahdi, the little we have is as great as abundance anywhere else." Just then a tall, frail figure in a white robe flitted like a ghost across the courtyard. It was Adam Bu Gemira. "There goes Sidi Adam," I said, pointing after him. "He was not looking well when he came to see me today. What ails him, I wonder?" "Nay, it is not his health, my master. It is an unlucky man who incurs the displeasure of our masters," meaning the Senussi chiefs. "The poor man is suffering for his brother's bad faith." It was then that the story of Bu Gemira was unfolded to me by Mabruk. Sidi Bu Saif Bu Gemira, Adam's brother, was at one time the trusted and all-powerful wakil of Sidi el-Mahdi at Jagbub. When he was quite a child, a wall fell upon him and smashed in his head. The great Sidi el-Senussi, founder of the sect, was fortunately nearby. He took the child's head and bandaged it together, saying, "This head will one day be a fountain of knowledge and enlightenment." His prophecy came true. Bu Saif's father sent the child to Jagbub when the Grand Senussi settled there, and left him to study at the mosque of Jagbub. He became the leading Ikhwan and great professor of Jagbub. He was also a poet of no small merit. After the death of the Grand Senussi, Sidi el-Mahdi took him up and made him his sole wakil at Jagbub when he left for Kufra, entrusting him with all his property and the management thereof. but God willed that he should become an example to the other equine of one who betrays the Asad, the master's trust. He ran with the world and was seduced by her. He squandered much of Sidi El Mahdi's property and sold many of his slaves, putting the money in his own pocket. It was decreed that he should be punished. He wrote a letter to a big governor in Egypt telling him that Sidi El Mahdi was away at Kufra and that there was no one at Jagbab to defend it, and that it was an opportune moment to occupy the place. Why he did this is inconceivable, as nobody ever had any desire to occupy Jagbab. But doubtless Busaif thought he might get something out of it. At that time, Sidi Muhammad el-Abid el-Sanusi, a nephew of El Mahdi, was staying at Jagbab. He heard that Busaif had written a letter and was sending it to Egypt, and that he had arranged for a messenger to take it across the frontier after nightfall. El-Abid at once dispatched 2 equine to waylay the messenger and bring him back the letter. 2 days later the messenger was brought. El-Abid saw the letter but said nothing to Busaif. He simply ordered a caravan to be prepared for Kufra and asked Busaif to accompany him. The latter tried to excuse himself on account of old age and health, but El-Abid insisted. He had no alternative but to go. So they set out on the silent journey across the desert, and on arrival at Kufra, the letter was shown by El-Abid to Sidi El Mahdi. On the Friday following their arrival, after the midday prayers at the Mosque of Taj in Kufra, Sidi El Mahdi called together all the equine, including Busaif. "Sidi Busaif, thou knowest what thou hast done." There was a hush. Everybody in the mosque tingled with excitement, knowing there was something to come. "But we shall not punish thee. Thou shalt live. Thou shalt draw thy pay and thy rations according to custom. God alone will punish those who have betrayed our trust. But thou shalt read aloud to this gathering of the equine the letter which thou hast written with thine own hand." Busaif had no alternative but to read the letter. The equine were silent, though there was much surprise, for this was thought to be the most trusted man of Sayyid El Mahdi. "Henceforward thou shalt be relieved of the trouble of looking after our affairs," said Sidi El Mahdi, dismissing him. Busaif was then led to his house, a sick man. He died a few days later. His 2 sons died in the following few months. His remaining 2 daughters were taken in marriage by members of the Sanusi family. All his books, and it is said he possessed the best library in the Sanusi circle, and his property were taken by the Sanusi family. The only remaining man of his family is Adam, his brother, who had inherited the empty house at Jagbab and the stigma attaching thereto. With the death of Adam, the family will be extinct. End of section 6. Chapter 8. Meals and Medicine. At intervals there were pleasant marks of hospitality from the Sanusi leaders at Jagbab. There are various forms of hospitality among the Bedouins, depending upon the rank both of the host and of the guest, and upon the circumstances of the given case. When a traveler comes to an oasis or a town in the desert, he has with him his own caravan, provided with all the necessities of living. He does not put up at a hotel or go to a friend's house to live, but sets up his own establishment, either pitching his tents and making a camp, or perhaps, as happened to me at Jagbab, at Jallo, and again at Kufra, occupying a house put at his disposal by someone in the place. Then comes the question of entertainment and honor from the dignitaries of the community. They may either invite one to luncheon or to dinner in their own houses, or send a meal to the guest at his own house or camp. The first form of hospitality I shall describe when we reach Jallo, where I was entertained by 12 or 15 notables in turn. The second form was that which I received at Jagbab. This variety of hospitality may be extended from 3 to 7 days, depending upon the respective ranks of host and guest. Several days after my arrival, Sidi Ibrahim and Sidi Mohi Eddin, young sons of Sayyid Ahmad, the former guardian of Sayyid Idris, who is now in Angora, Boys of 13 and 15 years of age made a beau geste of showing me hospitality. There arrived at my house a Bedouin of the Barasa tribe with 2 slaves laden with food. They set before me a feast of at least a score of dishes, and I was bidden to eat. The representative of my hosts sat courteously by, himself not touching a morsel, while I tasted the dishes in turn. No mortal man could eat them all and live. It was his function as deputy host to see that I lacked nothing to make the meal a satisfying and pleasant one, and to entertain me with conversation while I ate. The men of his tribe were the aristocrats of the desert, tall, erect, handsome, proud, and with the spirit and courage of lions. A Barasi, if he were alone in the midst of an alien tribe, would not hesitate to meet an insult or a discourtesy with instant challenge and to fight the whole lot single-handed, if it came to that. Under his solicitously attentive eye, and waited on by the slaves who accompanied him, I ate my meal. I am not sure that I can remember the full tale of the dishes that were set before me, but they ran something like this: a rich meat soup made with butter and rice, a great dish of boiled meat, a big bowl of rice with bits of meat in it, eggs hard-boiled, fried, and made into an omelette with onions and herbs, tripe, meat and tomato sauce, meat croquettes, sausages, vegetable marrows, bamia or okra, mulukia, an Egyptian vegetable with a peculiar flavor of its own, marrow stuffed with rice and bits of meat, couscous, a distinctively Arab dish made of flour and steamed, a salad, a kind of blancmange or pudding of corn flour and milk, Bedouin pancakes with honey, a sweet pudding of rice, a delicate kind of pastry made of flour with raisins and almonds. This last is an Egyptian dish rather than one native to the desert. The slave who had cooked my meal, knowing me to be an Egyptian, had put forth her best energies to please me, and as a climax had provided this Egyptian delicacy. At home we call it Saad el-Hanak, that which fills the mouth. It fills the soul of the epicure with joy as well. In the Bedouin cuisine, meat predominates, generally lamb or mutton. True hospitality without meat is impossible for the desert dweller to imagine. It is the keystone of the structure not only of Bedouin hospitality, but of Bedouin living, except, of course, when one is on the trek and cannot get it. A guest must be given meat, and it must be meat specially provided for him. When a Bedouin invites one to dine with him, he slaughters a sheep expressly for his visitor. As a rule, he will neither prepare the meal nor even kill the animal until one has arrived, in order that there may be no doubt that the preparations were made expressly for the guest. He carries this courtesy to the point of asking a guest, on his arrival to partake of a meal, to lend him a knife with which to slaughter a sheep, for hospitality demands that the guest shall be convinced that full honor is being done to him. The great variety of dishes on the Bedouin menu, when a friend or a stranger is being formally entertained, is the essence of the ceremony. The greater the number, the better the host, and the higher the honor he is able to pay the partaker of the meal. Bedouin entertaining concentrates itself upon food, for in the desert there is nothing to be had in the way of pleasure except eating. In the primitive surroundings of an oasis, to eat is the whole story. 2 incidents of that month in Jagbub interested me as illustrating how, with all their differences, the East and West are often humorously alike. The one incident was comic, but the other had pathos in it as well as humor. I had given instructions that no one who came to my house in quest of medicine should ever be turned away. Sidi Zuela, an Ikhwan, had appealed for help for his cough, and I had given him a bottle of cough syrup. 2 days later he appeared again. He said the first few doses had done him so much good that he had quickly finished the bottle. Might he have another bottle? Abdullahi, who was present at the interview, after his departure growled out a cynical comment. Yes, he found it sweet and pleasant to the taste. He takes it as a delicacy and not as a medicine. The comment was probably accurate. more than one child I had heard of during my years in England whose cough persisted strangely so long as the cough medicine was sweet and tasty. I am afraid that my men used to boast about the things that could be done with what we had among our stores. The Bashkari, after Ahmed had been pulling his leg about my having medicine for everything, came to me to ask for something to cure a slave girl of absent-mindedness. I could only reply that from my experience in various lands, to keep a servant from forgetting was as easy as to prevent water from sinking into the sand. The second incident involved two men as different as day and night. There came to my house one day a slave of the Wakil sent by his master to consult me. It was a matter about which Sidi Hassain could not approach me in person. Bedouin etiquette forbids a man to talk to another about his wife, or even about any particular woman who is not known to both of them. But a slave could say for him what his dignity forbade him to speak in person. The slave's message was that the wife of the Wakil had borne no children, which was a keen disappointment to her husband. Surely, his master thought, I must have in my medicine chest, filled with the wonders of the science of the West, some remedy for the poor woman's childless state. My thoughts went straight back to my last days at Oxford. An old college servant was an excellent fellow, but most inordinately shy. He came to me one day as I was preparing for the journey home, and with a tremendous summoning of his courage, proffered a request. "If you would allow me, sir," he said, "to ask a favor. My wife and I have no children. The doctor can't help us. He has nothing to suggest. Now, sir, back in that country of yours, I've heard it said they have wonderful talismans that will do all kinds of things. I'm not one who has believed much in having to do with magic, but this is a very special case. Do you think you might find me a talisman and send it on? If it's not asking too much, sir?" In the face of his anxiety and the courageous breaking down of the barriers of his shyness, I could only answer gravely but sympathetically that I would do what I could. But the necessity did not arise. He had died, remembered by Balliol men past and present, before I came to Oxford again. In the case of Sidi Hassain, however, I could not put that matter off. The slave was waiting for an answer, and doubtless his master was waiting for him. I thought quickly. I gave the slave half a bottle of Horlick's malted milk tablets, with solemn instructions that 3 were to be taken by the lady each day until all were gone. When the slave had left, I reflected on the amusing parallel between the two cases. There in Oxford, the West, having exhausted all that science had to offer on behalf of the universal desire for offspring, had tried to draw upon the spiritual resources of the East. Here in Jagbub, the East, finding all its spiritual appeals of no avail, had turned to the science of the West for aid. East or West, we alike believe in the miraculous power of the unknown. But all this pleasant, peaceful life and courteous hospitality did not produce camels. I sent messengers out into the surrounding country in quest of the beasts, making my offers of money for their hire larger and larger as time went on, but I could get no favorable responses. I invoked the aid of Sidi Hassain, but he professed himself powerless. I sent a messenger back to Siwa with a telegram to Sayed Idris in Egypt, informing him of my predicament and asking his aid. As soon as could be expected, a reply came directing Sidi Hassain to give me all the assistance in his power. Still, the Wakil seemed to be unable to help me. At last, when things began to seem hopeless, a Zawaya caravan arrived from Jallo on its way to Siwa for dates. I wanted those camels, but of course their owners had no desire to turn back without the dates they had come for. However, a way was found to persuade them, for I communicated to them through Sidi Hassain the news that an order had been issued by the Egyptian government forbidding Zawayas to enter Egyptian territory until they had composed their differences with the Awad Ali, who live in Egypt, and with whom they had a feud. Since they could not go to Siwa, which is in Egypt, without fear of punishment, there they were, stranded at Jagbub, with nothing to do but go back the way they came. That was precisely the way I wanted them to go. The combined effect of the order of the Egyptian government, of the message from Sayyid Idris, of the persuasions of Sidi Hassan, and of the promise of exorbitant prices for hire of their camels, which they succeeded in dragging out of me because of my necessity, finally made them agree to take me to Jallo. The quiet days of contemplation under the shadows of the white Kuba and the anxious days of striving for the means of continuing my journey came to an end at last. On February 22nd, 34 days after I had entered Jagbab, I turned my face to the westward and set out for Jallo. End of section 7. Chapter 9. Sandstorms and the Road to Jallo. I left Jagbab in accordance with the best tradition. It was a day of a sandstorm. The Bedouins say that to start a journey in a sandstorm is good luck. I am not sure, though, that they are not making a virtue of necessity. It is as though an Italian were to say that it is good luck to set out when the sun is shining, or a Scotsman when it is raining. Sandstorms are a commonplace in the desert, but as an experience there is nothing commonplace about them. The day dawns with a clear sky and no hint of storm or wind. The desert smiles upon our setting out, and the caravan moves forward cheerfully. Before long a refreshing breeze comes up from nowhere and goes whispering over the sands. Almost imperceptibly it strengthens, but still there is nothing unpleasant in its blowing. Then one looks down at one's feet, and the surface of the desert is curiously changed. It is as though the surface were underlaid with steam pipes with thousands of orifices through which tiny jets of steam are puffing out. The sand leaps in little spurts and whirls. Inch by inch the disturbance rises as the wind increases its force. It seems as though the whole surface of the desert were rising in obedience to some upthrusting force beneath. Larger pebbles strike against the shins, the knees, the thighs. The spray of dancing sand grains climbs the body till it strikes the face and goes over the head. The sky is shut out. All but the nearest camels fade from view. The universe is filled with hurtling, pelting, stinging, biting legions of torment. Well for the traveler then if the wind is blowing at his back. The torture of the driving sand against his face is bitter. He can scarcely keep his eyes open, and yet he dare not let them close, for one thing worse than the stinging of the sand grains is to lose one's way. Fortunately, the wind comes in driving gusts, spaced in groups of 3 or 4 with a few seconds of blessed lull after each group. While the gusts are making their assault, one turns one's face away, pulls one side of one's kufiya forward like a screen, and almost holds one's breath. When the lull comes, one puts the kufiya back, takes a quick look about to see that one has kept one's bearings, then swiftly prepares for the next attack. It is as though some great monster of fabled size and unearthly power were puffing out these hurtling blasts of sand upon the traveler's head. The sound is that of a giant hand drawing rough fingers in regular rhythm across tightly stretched silk. When the sandstorm comes, there is nothing to do but to push doggedly on. Around any stationary object, whether it might be a post, a camel, or a man, the eager sands swiftly gather, piling up and up until there remains only a smoothly rounded heap. If it is torture to go on, it is death itself to halt. A sandstorm is likely to be at its worst for 5 or 6 hours. While it persists, a caravan can only keep going, with careful vigilance that the direction be not missed. When the storm is at its fiercest, the camels will be scarcely moving, but their instinct tells them that it is death to halt. How instinctively wise they are is shown by the fact that when it begins to rain, they sense no such danger and will immediately stand still and even lie down. The storm drives the sand into everything one possesses. It fills clothes, food, baggage, instruments, everything. It searches out every weak spot in one's armor. One feels it, breathes it, eats it, drinks it, and hates it. The finest particles even penetrate the pores of the skin, setting up a distressing irritation. There are certain rules about the behavior of sandstorms which every Bedouin knows and is quite ready to tell the stranger to the desert. The wind that makes a storm will rise with the day or go to sleep with the sun. There will be no sandstorm at night when there is a moon. A sandstorm never joins the afternoon and evening. These are excellent rules, but on our trek to Jallo, every one of them was broken. We had storms when the moon was shining and storms when the night was dark. We had storms that began before dawn and storms that did not pause till long after the sun was set. We had storms that not only joined afternoon and evening, but wiped out the line of demarcation between them. We had little storms and great storms, the worst I had yet seen. Storms that were short and storms that were long. Storms by day and storms by night. But even under this interminable bombardment, I did not lose the spell of the desert's charm. Sometimes at evening, when we had been battling doggedly against the flying squadrons of the sand for hours, the wind would stop dead as if a master had put up a peremptory finger. Then, for an hour or so, the fine dust would settle slowly down like falling mist. But afterward the moon would rise, and under the pale magic of its flooding light, the desert would put on a new personality. Had there been a sandstorm? Who could remember? Could this peaceful expanse of loveliness ever be cruel? Who could believe it? The trek to Jallo was therefore not an easy one. The sandstorms were a constant annoyance and sometimes a menace. The latter part of the way led through a country of sand dunes, and the caravan had to go winding about among them. To keep one's course straight to the proper point of the compass in spite of those wrigglings and twistings takes all one's skill and attention at the best of times. When a sandstorm is torturing and blinding the whole caravan, the task becomes a staggering one. Nevertheless, we pushed steadily on, making on the whole good time of it. In spite of the viciousness of the attacking sands, there were hours of pleasure on this trek. Memorable were the genial evenings when we all gathered around the fire of Hatab for our after-dinner glasses of tea. Then stories would begin to go around. Old Mogahib, with the firelight playing on the gray hairs of his shaggy beard, would begin by telling bits of Zawiya history when his grandfather used to go to Wadai to fight the black tribes and bring back camels and slaves. Salah would follow with a tale of the great profits that his cousin had made on his last trip to Wadai, when he did not have to fight anybody, but brought back leather, ostrich feathers, and ivory to sell in Barca, which is the Arabic name for Cyrenaica. Then I would turn to Ali and demand a love song. He was a poet of sorts, and betrothed to Hassain's sister. If the girl is anything like her brother, the boy is not doing badly for himself. Ali would look to his uncle for permission to comply with my request, and find the old man busy with his rosary, pretending to be oblivious of the turn that matters had taken. It does not befit the dignity of a gray-haired Bedouin to sit and hear love songs from the younger generation. But his respect for me keeps him from leaving the gathering. Finally he mutters in his beard, "Sing to the Bey, since he likes to hear our Bedouin songs." Ali's pleasant voice rises on the evening air, and the beads of old Moghaib's rosary fall through his fingers with the deliberate regularity characteristic of a man who is conscious of nothing but his devotions. So Ali sings. I went singing, and all men turned to hear me. It is Kadra who draws the song from my soul. Red is her cheek, like spilt blood. Slim and round she is like a reed. None so young, none so old, not to know her. I met her in the way. I will flaunt her like a scarf upon my spear. As his voice dies away, is it my imagination, or are the rosary beads in Moghaib's fingers moving a little faster? After a pause, Ali sings again. Thou slim Narcissus of the gardener's pride, thy mouth flows honey over teeth of ivory. Thy waist is slender, like the lions running in the chase. Wilt thou have me, or thinkest thou of another? Thy form is rounded like a whip. To lie on their breast were to be in paradise. Love cannot be hidden, but fate is in the hands of God. There is silence in the cap, except for the murmur of the dying fire and the clicking of the rosary. But the rhythm of the beads has significantly changed now. Toward the end of Ali's song, Moghaib's fingers had stopped dead for a moment, and then hurried nervously on, as though to deny that they had halted. The old man had been a great lover in his time, and the boy's song had stirred his blood with memories. Perhaps it was fortunate for others around the fire that they had no clicking rosary beads to betray them. After Bu Salama Well, which is the day's trek from Jagbub, we were going through a region where there were remains of a petrified forest. At intervals we passed great blocks of stone erect like guideposts along the way. Ages ago they had been living trees, but now the forces of nature had transferred them from the vegetable kingdom to the mineral. A few smaller bits of petrified wood were scattered about, but most of those were hidden beneath the sand. The larger tree sections had remained visible because the etiquette of the desert demands that anyone passing such a fallen landmark shall set it erect again. It is also good form on a newly traveled track to build little piles of stones at intervals as notice to later comers that here lies the way. Sometimes one comes upon a tree or a shrub on which hang shreds and patches of clothing, and there one is under obligation to add a thread or a fragment from his own outfit. These accumulating tokens confirm the tree as a landmark to later comers and afford the encouragement of the thought that others have been this way before. In the dead waste and monotony of the desert, any evidence of the passing of one's fellow man is a cheering incident. The sight of camel dung, of the bleached bones of a camel, or even the skeleton of an unfortunate traveler are welcome to the eye, for at least they show that a caravan had passed that way. Shortly after leaving Jagbub, we came upon a different kind of landmark. It consisted of a row of small sand hillocks, like anthills, stretching across the track. It is called Alam Bu Zafar, the Bu Zafar landmark, and it is the sign and symbol of a pleasant Bedouin custom. On any trek, the newcomers to that particular route are expected to slaughter a sheep for those in the caravan who have come that way before. The custom is called Bu Zafar. If the novices do not awaken promptly to their responsibilities, the veterans give them a hint. One or two of them dash ahead of the caravan and build a row of sand piles across the way. When the caravan reaches a significant landmark, they call out suggestively, "Bu Zafar, Bu Zafar." Invariably the hint is taken, a sheep is slaughtered, and the ceremonial feast is held. In our caravan there were several who had not gone over this route before, including myself. I bought a sheep before leaving Jagbub so that we who were new to this route might give Bu Zafar to the old-timers. The Alam Bu Zafar that we came upon, therefore, was not of our making, but left by some other caravan. We were fortunate in finding grazing for our camels almost every day until we reached Jallo. Sometimes, it is true, we had to go out of our way to reach the patches of green among the sand dunes, but we always found them. 3 kinds of vegetation grow sparsely in infrequent spots in this part of the desert. Belbal is a grayish-green bush whose foliage is not good eating for the camels. It grows only in the vicinity of a well. Ordinarily the camels will not touch it, but if very hungry they will. Then unceasing vigilance is necessary to save oneself from the annoyance of having a sick camel on one's hands. Damran is a similar bush, but with darker foliage and with brown stems which make good fuel when dried. This is excellent food for the camels, and they eat it eagerly. The third variety of vegetation is Nisha, which grows in tufts of thin leaves up to a foot high. This, too, makes good grazing. It is only in the winter months, however, when the scanty rains come, that these plants are available. No Bedouin would think of making a journey between Jallo and Jagbub in summer without carrying a supply of fodder for his camels. On the 10th day from Jagbub, we reached the well of Hessalia, the first water after Bu Salama. It was marked by a few trees and small green bushes, and after we had scooped out the drifted sand with our hands, the water seemed good. But the after effects were not so pleasant. 2 days later, we found ourselves on the outskirts of the oasis of Jallo. Before we could enter, a messenger came rushing to meet us. He carried a letter from Sidi Mohammed el Zerwali, the Ikhwan, who had been directed by Sayyid Idris to accompany us to Kufra, asking me to camp outside until they could prepare to receive us properly. Sayyid Idris, before he had left Jallo 2 months before, had told them that I was on the way and directed that I should be shown all possible courtesy. They had expected us long before this, and when we did not come, they decided that I had changed my plans. We withdrew a short distance from the town and camped. A few hours later, an impressive group of a score or more Bedouins came out and drew themselves up in a long line before the village of Laba, one of the 2 villages that make up Jallo. Dressed in our cleanest and most ceremonial clothes, and my men provided with ammunition for the complimentary salute, we went forward. I approached and shook hands with Sidi Sanusi Gaderbu, the Kaimakan or governor of the district, the members of the council of Jala, and other prominent citizens. The Kaimakam made a speech of welcome, to which I replied. My men fired their guns in salute, and we passed into the town. I went to the house which was put at my disposal, and received a visit of ceremony from the council of Jallo and from Sidi el-Fadil, the uncle of Sayyid Idris. After dinner with Sanusi Gaderbu, I spent the evening in discussing plans for the trip with Sidi Zerwali. End of section 8. Chapter 10. At the Oasis of Jallo. Jallo is one of the most important oases in Cyrenaica. It lies about 240 kilometers from the Mediterranean at its nearest point, beyond Jeddah, and about 600 kilometers from Kufra, which is directly south. The oasis is not only the largest producer of dates in all the province, but it is the trade outlet for the products of Wadai and Darfur, which come through Kufra. Everything from the outside world that goes to Kufra passes through Jallo. The desert is a sea, said El-Bishari, a prominent chieftain of the Majabra tribe, and Jallo is its port. It was at the height of its importance, something like 30 years ago, when El-Mahdi maintained the Sanusi capital at Kufra. In those days, caravans of 200 or 300 camels came and went between Jallo and the south each week. But when I was there, the traffic had shrunk to less than a tenth of that. In summer, however, it is swollen by the demands of the date harvest. There are 2 villages at Jallo, over a mile apart, Erg and Laba. Between and around them are scattered the date palms in picturesque profusion to the number of nearly 100,000. 12 miles to the west lies Ujila, which is the ancient oasis mentioned by Herodotus as famous for its dates. In Ujila is the tomb of Abdullah el-Sahabi, who is reputed to have been a clerk of the Prophet Muhammad. Whether such is actually the case is somewhat problematical, but at least the Prophet did have a clerk named Abdullahi el-Sahabi, that Abdullahi did come to North Africa, and the tomb of a man of that name is found at Ujila. Many a tradition has been based on flimsier evidence. The story is told that the Grand Sanusi found the body of Sahabi buried in a remote spot, and forthwith saw in a vision the spirit which had once inhabited the body. "Dig up my body," said the ghostly visitor. "Put it on a camel and go forth. Where the camel halts, there you shall build my tomb." The Grand Sanusi obeyed the injunction and journeyed till he came to Ujila. There the camel stopped dead and refused to go on, and on the spot the tomb was built. The founder of the Sanusi sect and all the members of the Sanusi family and even their prominent Ikhwan are believed to possess occult powers and second sight. Sayyid el-Mahdi is credited with having particularly strong occult powers, which the Bedouins call miracles. One of the Ikhwan at Jagbab told me the following story about Sayyid el-Mahdi. An ignorant Bedouin came to him, intending to study under him at Jagbub. Suddenly the man realized that it was the sowing season, and that he had nobody to look after the sowing of his land. So he thought it best to go away till after the crop season, and then return to his studies. He went to say goodbye to Sayyid el-Mahdi. He entered the room, sat down, and, as is the custom, waited until he was spoken to. Sayyid el-Mahdi appeared to ignore him for a few minutes. The man felt sleepy and just dozed off for a minute or two, awaking to Sayyid el-Mahdi's gentle voice saying, "Now you feel at rest, and you know that matters have been arranged for you." In that short time the man had seen in a dream his brother plowing his land and sowing the barley crop. "Now you shall be our guest," continued the Sayyid, "and study and pray that God may guide you to the right path. All will be provided for, as you have seen, and you will have no reason to worry. God is merciful, and he looks after us all." The man remained at Jagbub, and afterward went home just in time for the harvest. On his return to Jagbub, he told one of the Ikhwan that not only had his crop been sown as he saw in the dream, but the place seen and the time of the dream were exactly corroborated by the facts. Another incident was told me by the Kamakan of Jallo. He was traveling with a party from Benghazi to Jagbub to visit Sayyid el-Mahdi. They missed a well and were in dire straits. At night, a man, the least enthusiastic of the pilgrims, turned to him and said, "Now that you have brought us to visit this wonderful man, Sayyid el-Mahdi, will you ask him to send us some water if he be saintly as you say he is?" That same night at Jagbub, Sayyid el-Mahdi, so the story goes, ordered 2 of his slaves to take 5 camels loaded with water and food, and going out into the open, he indicated the direction they should take, adding that until they met a caravan they must not stop by the way. In due course they came across the caravan in distress and rescued it. There are some of the old Ikhwans still living whom even members of the Sanusi family themselves avoid displeasing because they fear their occult powers. One of these who lives at Kufra was the Ikhwan of a Zawiya in Cyrenaica. A Bedouin once brought some sheep to water at the well, and some of them strayed into the patch of ground attached to the Zawiya and ate the young barley. The Ikhwan warned the Bedouin to stop his sheep from doing this, and the man pretended to pay attention, but was really determined that not only these sheep but the whole flock should go in and help themselves to the crop. And when the Ikhwan came out again, it was to see all the flock feeding on his barley. "May God curse them," he cried, "the sheep that eat the crop of the Zawiya." The story goes that not a single sheep emerged alive from the Zawiya garden. Until this day the Bedouins fear the Sanusi family not so much because of any temporal power, but on account of the spiritual powers with which they credit them. A Bedouin cursed by one of the Sanusi family lives the whole time in fear of something awful about to happen to him. His friends, even his own people, try to avoid his presence lest the curse upon him should account for a harm to them also. There is the famous case of the chief clerk of Sayyid el-Mahdi, who lies in Kufra now, half paralyzed. I went to see him. He was quite happy and very content in spite of the fact that he could not move his body. On my second visit he was getting confidential, and, half believing, half disbelieving, asked if I had any medicine for his malady. I hesitated, for I did not want the man to lose hope entirely. He saw this, and without even giving me the chance of answering him, said, "No, it is decreed that it should be thus. It was my fault. Sayyid el-Mahdi wanted me to journey north. I could not disobey him, but I tried to avoid the journey. I went as far as Hawari, and there wrote to him pretending to be ill. The answer came by a messenger that if I were ill, I should certainly be relieved of the journey. The next day I was struck with paralysis and brought back to Kufra, and have been here ever since. That was 25 years ago." The Kaimakam at Jallo told me a story when we were discussing miracles. He said that on one occasion there was a very severe sandstorm, which nearly covered the whole of the tomb at Augila. So they brought the slaves to dig it out again. As it was being dug out, the Kaimakan came into the chamber which contained the shrine and noticed a very strong smell of incense. He called one of the slaves and asked whether he had burned any incense. The man denied it, yet till now, upon occasion, a visitor to the tomb will smell this incense, though it is known that none has been burned. Jallo is the headquarters of the Majabra tribe of Bedouins, the merchant princes of the Libyan desert. A few Zawayas are also found there, but the Majabras make up the great majority of the 2,000 inhabitants of the two villages. The Majabras have wonderful business instinct. The Majbari boasts of his father having died in the basur, the camel saddle, as the son of a soldier might boast that his father died on the field of battle. When I was in Jallo, the Italian authorities, who were then on unfriendly terms with Sayyid Idris, had prohibited the sending of goods from Benghazi and other points of Cyrenaica into the interior. Consequently, prices of commodities at such inland places as Jedabiyah went up with a leap. Majabra merchants, arriving at Jallo with caravans of goods from Egypt, heard of this abnormal situation in the north. Without a moment's hesitation, they changed their plans, trekked north instead of south, and sold their goods to splendid advantage in Jedabiyah. Then back they dashed, if the camel's pace of less than 3 miles an hour can be so described, to Egypt or the south for another caravan load. Arrived again at Jallo with their merchandise, they inquired carefully as to comparative conditions in the markets of Jedabiyah and Kufra, and directed their further journey accordingly. Considering the remoteness of the desert places, Jallo 5 days from Jedabiyah, Kufra from 12 to 18 days from Jallo, and the snail-like speed of a caravan, news travels across the desert with surprising swiftness. At least it seems so. I suppose the true explanation is that all things are relative, and while the news moves at a camel's pace, so does everything else. While the Majabras are the great traders of the Libyan desert, the Zawayas have also their claims to prominence. The rivalry between the two tribes is always present under the surface, and occasionally it flashes forth into the light. There is some envy of the Zawayas by all the other tribes of Cyrenaica, because the man second in importance to Sayyid Idris among the Senussis is Ali Pasha al-Abdiya, who is a Zawayi. Abdiya is a splendid soldier, a powerful support to Sayyid Idris, and a man much trusted by the Senussi leader. One evening after dinner at Jallo, some expression of this rivalry was given by Sidi Salah, who belonged to no tribe in Cyrenaica, and was in fact a sharif or descendant of the Prophet, in an argument with Mogahib and Zerwali, who were both Zawayas. Mogahib launched into a little history of the achievements of the Zawayas. Sidi Salah listened to the Zawaya's eulogy of the tribe, shook his head, and remarked, "Their history may be as glorious as Sidi Moghaib tells us, but they do not fear God." At this, Moghaib burst forth, "By God, Sidi Salah, they may not fear God, but neither do they fear man. Woe unto him who dares molest their caravan or attack their camp." Then he came quickly over to me and continued, "We have the blessing of El Mahdi upon us, for it was to our headquarters in Kufra that Sidi El Mahdi came, and from which he disappeared." The Senussis will never say that El Mahdi died, but always that he disappeared, or some equivalent expression. In fact, there is a legend among them that he is not dead, but wandering over the earth until such time as he shall come again to his desert people. To the Zawayas, El Mahdi is the most beloved of the Senussi leaders because it was he who moved the center of activity of the Brotherhood to Kufra, their headquarters. The Kuba of the mosque that he built is the glory of Kufra. In my own experience, the Zawayas at times showed hostility and made it clear that, although I was a Moslem, the son of a religious man, and a confidant of Sayyid Idris, they did not want me in Kufra. Some of them even expressed the hope that they would have seen the last of me when I left Kufra. In spite of this scarcely veiled antagonism to me, however, I never expect to find better men for a desert journey than the Zawayas who form part of my caravan. Zerwali in particular, a typical Zawaya Bedouin, was the best of companions and the most reliable of associates. The Bedouin of Cyrenaica has in him the blood of the Arabs who passed through the north of Africa on their way to Spain. Although he has mixed with other native tribes of North Africa, he still preserves the old Arab tradition. In the case of a murder among the Senussis, the Bedouins have their own law. As a rule, the Senussi Ikhwan intervenes as a peaceful intermediary. He takes the murderer and an old member of his tribe and goes to the murdered man's camp, pitching camp nearby. The Ikhwan then approaches the family of the murdered man, saying, "He who murdered your man is here," and taking him by the hand, he adds, "This is he who murdered your son. I hand him over to you that you may do as you will with him." Usually the answer is, "May God forgive him, and may God's justice and mercy fall upon him." Thereupon the Ikhwan starts arranging for the blood money, which is generally $3,000 and a slave, the market value of the latter being known. The injured party may choose between accepting the money or having its equivalent in camels, sheep, or other commodities. The money may be paid in installments, extending over from 1 to 3 years, and the arrangement is generally carried through. In very rare cases or a deep-rooted feud, the family of the deceased refuse to accept the blood money, which means that they intend to kill the murderer himself, or else one of his relations or a leading member of his tribe. Bedouin boys and girls mix freely. It is only in the higher families that the women are kept in seclusion. As a rule, a boy knows his sweetheart, and he goes to her camp and sings to her, generally in verse of his own making. If she likes him, she comes out and answers his song, not rarely in words of her own composition also. The boy then goes and asks for the girl from her people, paying a dowry if an agreement is reached. Then, with ceremonial, he goes with his friends and takes the girl home to his camp amid displays of horsemanship and much firing of guns. Cases have been known of elopements which usually end in feuds between tribes, for the Bedouins look upon the man as having stolen the girl from them. There is a marriage contract, in many cases drawn up by the Ikhwan, and the marriage takes place according to the Moslem religion. Marriages take place at a very early age, according to the development of the girl, who may be 13 or 14, while the boy is between 17 and 20. Bedouins who can afford it marry more than one wife, but in that case the first wife remains the mistress of the house and takes precedence even over the favorite wife in anything that has to do with household management. I have heard of many cases of lads going off their heads through falling in love with a girl they could not marry. A Bedouin boy once came to me to ask for medicine. He looked very frail. He was slim, with a rather refined face, and spoke very little. "I have come to ask you for medicine to give me health," he said. He shook his head when I asked him what was his ailment, and answered, "God knows best." There was something queer about the boy, something that puzzled me, but, as usual in these cases, a few malted milk tablets were wrapped up carefully in paper and given to him with strict orders not to take more than 3 each day. When the boy had gone, an elderly man came to my tent. He squatted on the floor. "May God give you health and make your hand give recovery. My son came to you just now, and you gave him medicine. I have come to explain his ailment. He is always weak and afflicted by headaches. When night falls, he shuns everybody and seeks solitude. Often he goes out to spend the night in the open." I told the old man that the medicine I had given the boy was the only one I had that might give some relief. "Recovery comes from God," replied the man in a sad voice. "We know his remedy, but it is decreed that he should not have it. The boy is in love with a girl whose parents refuse to give her to him in marriage." "Why don't you make an effort, if you know that this is the reason of your son's illness, and try to get the girl in marriage for your son?" "It is too late now," replied the father. "She is already married. But God knows best. She may be many days' journey away from here, but she is suffering from the same ailment." With that he rose and left my tent, a resigned, pathetic figure. At Jallo, as at Jagbub, there were no camels waiting for me when I arrived. But the reason was not the same, nor the uncertainty so disturbing. The hire of the necessary camels had been arranged for, and Omar Bu Halega, their owner, was ready to start just as soon as the beasts returned from grazing. No good Bedouin starts out on a long trek until his camels have been fattened and especially have had their fill of green fodder. A long stretch like that to Kufra, with no grazing on the way, means feeding the camels on dried dates exclusively. Dates, say the camelmen, are hot on the liver. Therefore, they prepare their animals for the ordeal by a course of green feeding before they start. Bu Halega's camels had been taken to a nearby grazing grounds for this course of preparation, and on the appointed day for their return they did not appear. The next day I wondered about them, the second day I was concerned, and the day after that worried, lest, when taken from grazing, the beasts might have run away. However, they had not done so. They put in their appearance on the fourth day, and when they came, they were in excellent condition. I hired 35 camels, paying a high price for them. I could have bought the beasts outright for from 12 to 18 pounds, while Bu Halega demanded 13.5 pounds for their hire for the 2 or 3 months' journey to Abéché in Wadai. But it was better so. If I had owned the camels myself, the responsibility for their welfare would have been all mine. It would have been my men who had them in charge, with no motive beyond the general one of loyalty to the leader in the job for carrying the camels through in good condition. But when Bu Halega's men went along with his own animals, they were sure to have the best of care. During the trek to Kufra, he kept his eye expertly on each one of them. If a camel weakened or seemed ill, he shifted loads to meet the emergency. He did everything to keep them fit to the journey's end, and his care of them was worth to me all that it cost. In addition to camels, I needed more men. The 4 who had been hired in Cairo, Sollum, and Siwa were still with me: Abdullahi, Ahmed, Hamad, and Ismail. I now added 5 more: Zerwali, Sunusi Bu Hassan, the guide, Saad, who came from Ojila, Hamid, and Faraj, a slave. Bu Helena had with him his son and 2 camelmen. The list was supplemented at the last by 5 Tibus, nomadic blacks from Tibesti, a region northwest of Wadai. Abdullahi and Zerwali were the 2 headmen of the caravan. The former was in command of the luggage and the commissariat, while Zerwali was in charge of the camels and the men. They were the best companions that any man could have on a desert trek. We needed clothing, certain articles of food, and shoes, especially the last. The heelless Bedouin slipper is the only possible wear for the desert, but it will wear out, and it often has to be repaired on the way. It was necessary to be sure that each of us had not only shoes, but the leather that we should need for patching them until we reached Kufra. At Jallo I found a famous shoemaker, Himaida, whom I had met at Kufra 2 years before. I had with me the very shoes that he had made for me then, with soles badly in need of patching. Great was his delight when I took them to him for his ministrations. He was a venerable-looking personage, whom it would have been easy to take for a judge or a member of the council at least. He came to my house day after day to work on the 5 pairs of shoes he made for me, on the making of shoes for my men, and on the repairing of our saddles and other leather accoutrements. It was a pleasure to give him a meal and then invite him to a friendly glass of tea. One day he was coughing as the tea was brought, and I expressed sympathy for his ailment. He looked at me across his glass and answered in his quiet voice, "But your tea always stops my cough, Sidi El Bey. Not other tea, but yours always does." I did not ignore the hint so gracefully given. Himaida received his little packet of the miraculous tea as a present before we left Jallo. Besides my shoes and the leather, I bought cloth for clothing for my men, butter, oil, barley, firewood, and 8 girbas. Ali Khaja, who was the favorite slave of Sayyid Idris and had been made by him his trusted personal wakil in Jallo, told me that his master had directed him to put all his store of supplies of every kind at my disposal. I thanked him, but did not avail myself of the offer. I had just come from Egypt, well equipped, and I knew how much these stores meant to those who lived in this isolated spot. Besides the making of preparations, my 10 days in Jala were spent in receiving and giving entertainment and in scientific work. The entertainment was up to the best Bedouin standards. The first day I dined with Sanusi Gadarbu, the Kaimakan or governor of Jallo. The second day I lunched at the house of El Bishari, the most important of the Majabra merchant chiefs, waited on by my host and his sons. The third day, luncheon was sent to me by members of the council, and I was joined in the repast by Zerwali, the Cadi or judge, Ali Khaja, and Mogahib. After the meal I had a talk with the Cadi on Sanusi history, and was shown letters from the Grand Sanusi and from El Mahdi, his son. Dinner that day came from Haj Farahat, another Majbari merchant, with the Kaimakan, Zerwali, Ali Khaja, Moghaib, and Abdullahi as sharers of the feast. We discussed the custom of Buzafar, which all agreed must not be a meal, but the slaughtering and eating of a sheep. On the fourth day I lunched at the house of Haj Ali Bilal, a Majbari. My diary records the fact that there was the usual crowd and a very good lunch. Dinner was sent to me by Haj Said, also one of the Majabra merchants, and the Kaimakan, Zerwali, and the Cadi joined me in it. On the next day I lunched at the house of Haj Grayable, and that evening my most interesting experience in the way of hospitality took place. There were living at Jallo several ladies of the Sanusi family, including the wife of Sayyid Idris and his sister. Shortly after my arrival at Jallo, they sent me an invitation to dinner. This was an unusual occurrence, for Bedouin women of high class do not offer entertainment to men, as women of the Western world may do with perfect propriety. I realized, of course, that I would not actually dine with my hostesses in person, but I was appreciative of the unprecedented honor nevertheless. At the appointed hour, Zerwali and the Kaimakan came to escort me to dinner. The house which the ladies occupied was the former government house of the days of Turkish rule. We were ushered into a spacious room where the soft light from a magnificent brass lantern and innumerable candles served to deepen the mellow tones and the rich combinations of color of priceless rugs and silken cushions. Sidi Salad, who was the husband of one of the Sanusi ladies, acted as host on their behalf. Under his hospitable direction, a splendid banquet was served to us by half a dozen slaves. When we had eaten all that was demanded by courtesy, and, I am afraid, much more than was required by nature, the banquet was completed with the washing of our hands in basins brought by the slaves, the ceremonial 3 glasses of tea, the sprinkling over us of rose water, and the burning of incense before us. Then the chief slave came and deferentially whispered in my ear, "Would the Bey care to hear some music?" There was a gramophone with records made by the famous singers of Egypt. The Bey had only to command. Perhaps to the disappointment of my companions, I do not know, but quite to my own satisfaction, I courteously declined the offered entertainment. There was something rare and precious in the perfumed atmosphere of that softly lighted room which the coming of voices from beyond the desert would have profaned. Partly the beauty of the place, the remoteness from the world, but especially the sense that I was the guest of noble Bedouin women, who were hidden from me by the customs of our eastern lands, but were in a real sense present through their gracious hospitality and kindly thoughtfulness, made of that evening a unique memory. I told the slave to convey my respectful salams to the ladies, and to tell them how much I had been touched by their courtesy. Then I went out into the clear desert night, with a soft breeze stirring little breaths of incense from the folds of my jerd to remind me vividly of the peace and mystic calm of the room from which I had come. The next day I returned the hospitality of those who had entertained me so generously. My room, with its dry mud floor and travel-stained luggage ranged about the walls, could not bear a comparison with the charming apartment in which I had dined the night before. But Ali Khaja took it upon himself to see that we were made as presentable as circumstances would permit. With a pair of beautiful brass lanterns and a few rugs borrowed from Saya Idris's house and some other accessories, he created a very decent imitation of a banquet hall. My guests included the Kaimakam, members of the council, the two Ikhwan, the judge, Ali Khaja, Musa, the captain of the Sanusi artillery, and Zerwali. Dressed in my best Bedouin robes, I waited on them as a Bedouin host should, and when some of them who had been out into the world asked me to sit with them and eat, I assured them that I would, when they were my guests in Cairo. Ahmed, my cook, had laid himself out to provide several distinctively European dishes to give a note of novelty to our entertaining, and the delight of my guests was great at his achievements. My banquet ended the round of entertaining, and for a day or two I was permitted to lunch and dine in peaceful solitude. It was a relief, grateful though I had been to my generous hosts for their hospitality. An important part of my activities at Jala was the making of scientific observations. I observed the sun and the stars to determine the latitude and longitude, and took regular readings of the aneroid barometer and thermometer for the determination of the altitude. My observations on the latter point, when finally worked out in relation to barometric records made on the same days at Siwa, disclosed the interesting fact that the level of Jala is 60 meters higher today than it was when Rolfs ascertained it in 1879. He found Jala almost exactly at sea level. I found it 60 meters higher. I saw the explanation of it going on before my eyes. The drifting sands were climbing slowly up the trunks of the palm trees and against the walls of the houses, threatening to engulf them. Some of the inhabitants had already moved their houses and rebuilt them on higher levels. It is the steadily accumulating sand, driven by sandstorms and gathering wherever trees and houses stop its progress, that has raised Jala nearly 200 feet above sea level in 44 years. The house I was living in, and at which the barometric readings were recorded, was from 15 to 20 meters higher than the rest of the houses at Jala. In the taking of my observations I had to be cautious, for the Bedouins are suspicious of anything so elaborately scientific-looking as a theodolite. They were sure to say that I was making a map with a view to coming back and conquering their land. The first time that a Bedouin chief and the man who was to guide us to Kufra caught me at my theodolite, I had to explain hastily and persuasively that I was getting data for the making of a calendar for the month of Ramadan. Abdullahi, who was of course not a Bedouin, was invaluable to me in the camouflaging of my scientific activities. In fact, he was rather a specialist in the manufacture of those little inaccuracies that smooth the path of life and preserve the social amenities. One day we were using the theodolite some distance from the town. A native demanded what we were doing, and Abdullahi said we were taking a picture of Jala. "How can that be at such a distance?" demanded the Bedouin. Abdullahi had his explanation ready. "The machine attracts the picture so that it comes right out and flies into it," he asserted glibly. "But how can a box attract a picture?" demanded the incredulous Bedouin. Abdullahi struck an attitude. "Ask the magnet how it attracts the iron," he commanded rhetorically, and the debate was closed. End of section 9. Chapter 11. On the Trek. On Thursday, March 15th, we were ready to trek. I got up at 6 to pack and get my baggage ready. As is usual on the first day of a journey, when the caravan is not yet shaken down and accustomed to the routine, it took us 3 hours to load. We were to follow the Bedouin custom of tag hees, which means going to a nearby well before beginning a journey, and spending several days, sometimes a week, in final preparations away from the distractions of town life. Boutefal Well, 30 kilometers from Jallo, was the point where we were to make our taghees, or preparation. When the packing was well under way, the Kaimakam, Notables, and Equan came to give us the ceremonial mo'ada, or farewell. We squatted together and discussed the prospects for the journey. I had made the same trip to Kufra 2 years before under somewhat more favorable conditions, and nevertheless we had lost our way before getting to Kufra. It had been cooler then. 2 months earlier in the year, the winds and sandstorms had not been so incessant, and the caravan had been smaller. The problem of providing camels, their fodder, men, and food, and equipment for the men did not arise then, as the whole caravan was produced complete and provided for by the generosity of Sayyid Idris, a fact which had a considerable effect in lulling suspicions of the Bedouins and subduing their hostility to strangers. On this occasion I had to arrange for the camels and personnel, and so big a caravan, journeying with a quantity of unusual luggage necessary for a long journey, naturally aroused curiosity. On these long, waterless treks, nature is often the only enemy, and she can be one if she chooses. The men of my caravan worked well together. The 4 whom I had brought from Cairo, Salim and Siwa, got on excellently with all the people we met. Sir Wali, the Sanusi Equan delegated by Sayyid Idris to accompany us, was kindness itself, and did everything in his power to make the journey as comfortable as possible. I felt no real concern over the outcome, no matter what nature might choose to do. When the camels were all loaded, we went through the dignified ceremony of the farewell. We took our stand in 2 half circles facing each other, the men of my caravan and myself in one, and the chiefs of Jallo and the Equan in the other. Solemnly and reverently we raised our hands, palms upward, for prayers that the journey should be a blessed one, that God would guide us and return us safe to our homes. We read the Fatiha, the first chapter of the Koran, the oldest of the Equan saying the Amen. Then we shook hands and parted. The shouts of the men urging on the camels were echoed by lulias from the women of the village, and we were on our way. As we passed El Leba, the second village of Jallo, a pleasant incident occurred to send us cheerfully on our way. The solitary, graceful figure of a girl appeared beside our path, her face hidden from us by the Bedouin veil. With one voice the men nearest her called out the traditional greeting, "Wajik, Wajik, your face, your face." The girl turned and demurely drew aside her veil to disclose the finely chiseled features, the clear olive skin, and the shy yet dignified expression of a Bedouin maiden. The men shouted with delight at her beauty and her courtesy. To complete the tradition, I ordered them to empty gunpowder at her feet. Ahmad and Saad performed the graceful ceremony, first one and then the other. The man danced lightly toward her as if to the imaginary rhythm of a Bedouin drum, his rifle held in both hands over his head, the muzzle pointing forward, shouting a desert love song as he went. Just in front of her he dropped lightly on one knee, brought his gun to the vertical position, butt upward, and fired, a hair's breadth from her feet. So close was the shot, and so accurate his aim, that the girl's slippers were singed by the powder flash. She did not flinch at the explosion, but stood gracefully erect in her pride at the honor done her. Singed slippers are a mark of distinction in the desert that any Bedouin girl cherishes. When Saad had followed Hamad's example, another shout rose from the men of the caravan, and we moved on. The girl smiled after us, as flattered by the homage that had been paid her as we were by the good omen of a pretty face crossing our path at the outset of our journey. Within an hour we were in the open desert again. 8 hours' trekking brought us to Boutefal Well, where we were to stop a day. We took matters easily that first night, with singing and conversation about the campfire till after midnight. When the camp had settled down for the night, I took my pipe and went for a stroll. This was always one of the pleasures of my life in the desert, that last pipe of peace before turning in, and of peace it always was. If the day had been good, there was contentment. If bad, there was hope for the next day, and faith that all would be well. During the whole journey, I never went to sleep with anything really worrying me, worrying, that is, my mind itself, no matter how I might have been tried by the occurrences or by conditions. The next day was spent in final preparations. Bu Halega, the owner of the camels, arrived with his own little caravan of 3 camels. During the day another man had come from Jalo to catch up with us. We had been in need of rope and twine, but the price asked by the dealers had been too high. So Abdullahi chatted with them and left the actual closing of the bargain to the last minute. Then he had arranged with a man named Sunusi Bujabir to bring the rope after us to Budafal. When this man arrived, he came to my tent to tell me that his brother was in Wadai and to ask me to take him with us. He would work to pay for his passage. I looked him over and quickly decided that he would do. I discovered particularly that he had a sense of humor, almost, if not quite, the most valuable asset in desert travel. Ability may fail, but a keen sense of humor enables one to get the last ounce out of a man in possession of it. I was ready to take him, but it did not seem possible. "We are leaving at once," I said. "There is no time for you to make the day's journey to Jalo and back for your luggage." "I have it," he said. "Where is it?" I demanded, looking about in bewilderment. "Here," he answered, pointing to the shirt he wore and the stick he carried. I burst into a hearty laugh at the idea of such an outfit for a hard desert trek, and he joined me cheerfully. I assured him that he might go, and never regretted my decision. He proved to be one of the best men I had. The next morning we watered the camels, a process which must not be hurried. Nothing is more important in trekking than the condition of your camels. Not only must they be fat and well nourished at the start, but they must be allowed to drink their fill with deliberation and permitted to rest after drinking. When the camels were ready, they were loaded with the greatest care, for good packing and loading at the beginning mean time and trouble saved all through the journey. The rapidity with which the loading and unloading can be accomplished day after day sometimes means a gain of a day or two in time before the trip is over. At 2:30 we were ready to start. As the camels moved slowly off, the sonorous voice of Buhalega rose in the azan, the calling to prayers, according to Bedouin custom at the beginning of a long trek. It is the Bedouin tradition that those who begin the journey with the azan will end it with the azan. They will, that is, meet with no disaster by the way. Our caravan had gradually become enlarged until it consisted of 39 camels, 21 men, a horse, and a dog. Our personnel was as follows: myself and my 4 men, Abdullahi, Ahmed, Hamad, and Ismail; Zerwali, Buhalega, the owner of the camels, with his son, his nephew, and his slave. There was also Dawood, Zerwali's uncle, who was going with a single camel to Tizerbo to bring back his wife and daughter; Sunusi Bu Hassan, our guide; Sunusi Bojibir, the boy with the shirt and staff; Hamad Zawaya, another boy who was a pleasant singer; Saad the Aujuli; Faraj the slave; 2 Tibus with their 3 camels. In addition, there were 3 other Tibus with 3 camels loaded with merchandise which they were taking to deliver to merchants in Kufra. We set our faces southward and journeyed toward Kufra. It was hot and windy, and the desert lay about us like an interminable pancake. The ground was seria, which is flat, hard sand, with a little gravel scattered over it. Our first objective was the Zigan well, which we ought to make in 8 or 9 days. In the old days, before the time of the Sunusis, it had been the custom to make the trek from Jalo to Zigan in 3 days and 5 nights, marching continuously without a stop for food or rest. But the Sunusis changed all that. They inaugurated the custom of taking enough water and food to permit the journey to be made in twice the time, with adequate rest for camels and men each day. At first our camels moved reluctantly, for they had just left good grazing and would much rather have gone back to it. Buhalega tried his best to persuade the trading Tibus to lead the caravan with their camels, but they cleverly refused. The place of honor at the head of the line is an arduous one. Camels are quite ready to follow others ahead of them, but dislike to go forward independently. So the first camel in the caravan has to be driven and often beaten with a stick to keep him going. The Tibus preferred to bring up the trail of the procession where their camels needed no urging. But Buhalega got even with them later, however, because of their choice of position. It was hot and windy all the afternoon, but in the evening the wind dropped to a gentle breeze, and the desert put forth its full charm. I find recorded in my diary some of the thoughts and feelings on getting back into this old familiar desert where I was approaching the point at which we lost our way 2 years before. The same old flat desert and feelings of old memories. How one forgives the desert her scorching sun and her torturing wind for the calm of the evening, the sunset, and the moon rising, and then that gentle and serene breeze. How easily one forgets the presence of her dangers. It is the full appreciation of simple pleasures that endears the desert to one, in spite of all her harshnesses and crudities. A glass of tea, a cigarette, a pipe when the caravan is asleep and the fragrance of the tobacco is wafted by the gently stirring air. A glimpse of the playing of the firelight on the faces of the men of the caravan, some old and rugged, some smooth and youthful. To see men toil, succeed and fail and suffer in another sphere of life. Above all, to be near to God and to feel His presence. On the 18th, we got up at 6, and the camels were briskly loaded in 35 minutes. The careful first loading at Jallow and Butterfall made speed possible now. Nevertheless, it was 9 o'clock before we were ready for the start. The morning program in camp is not one that can be safely hurried. The Bedouin dislikes intensely to be rushed over his meals or to be deprived of those moments of leisure thereafter which are so essential to peaceful digestion and a contented spirit. The wise leader will see that these prejudices of his men are carefully observed. Perhaps this is a good place to set down the outline of a typical day's trek under the conditions which prevailed until we reached Arkanu. Although it is March, it is still cold in the morning, and one gets up a little after dawn because it is too cold to stay in bed longer. Even the sleeping bag and the Bedouin blanket will not keep out the chill. A peep through the flaps of the tent shows that the stars are paling in the sky. Someone has the fire already started, and the first impulse is to get to it without delay. Throwing my dirt about me and wrapping the kufiya around my ears, I dash out to the crackling blaze. There is nothing hot about the desert in these crisp morning hours. I stand by the fire and have a look around. There is little life in the camp yet, though all the men are up. They are huddled close to the warmth, muffled in jerds and every other garment that they can lay their hands on. When water is plenty, steaming hot glasses of tea are handed around, and after they are drunk, the activities of the camp divide. The camelmen go to feed the camels with dried dates, which the beasts munch reflectively, stones and all. A consultation is sometimes held over the camels, if some of them have suffered the previous day from too heavy loads. Perhaps a shifting of loads is decided on, or better packing and loading recommended. Other men are pulling down the 3 tents, which form the apexes of a triangle with the camels parked at its center. The luggage which had been set up as a barricade against the icy wind is sorted out and arranged ready for the loading. Meanwhile, I have been attending to the barometer and the thermometer, registering their readings, filling in the spaces in my scientific diary, seeing that the cameras have fresh films. The voices of the men sound low through the camp, muffled by kufiyas and extra clothing. At last, breakfast is ready. It may be asida, the Bedouin national dish, a kind of pudding baked of flour, oil, and spices, or it may be rice. It is an utterly simple meal in either case, but with what keen appetite one attacks it. In the desert, any disinclination for the first meal of the day that one may feel in city surroundings vanishes away. breakfast is finished off with the inevitable 3 glasses of tea, taken slowly and reflectively. Whatever one does, one must not deprive one's men of their tea or hurry them over it. Give a Bedouin a filling meal and let him sip 3 glasses of tea after it, and you can get any work out of him that you want. Stint him or rush him, and you will get worse than nothing. After breakfast, everyone is warm and contented and ready to work hard. The loading goes on swiftly, diversified at times by the antics of the 2 or 3 young and frolicsome camels that seem to get into every caravan. These young fellows resist being loaded and even throw off their loads when the job is apparently all finished. Zerwali and Abdullahi are alert to see that the loading is done with the utmost care and precision. An extra half-hour spent now may save 2 or 3 hours delay on the road later, caused by the slipping of the loads or improper distribution of the burdens. When the caravan is all but ready, I have a few words with the guide about the direction of our day's march. He draws a line on the sand and says that there lies our way. I take a bearing of the line with my compass, a proceeding which doubtless seems to him an absurd if harmless idiosyncrasy of mine, but I like to be able to check with the compass the direction the caravan is taking as the day goes on. On the whole, the precaution proves unnecessary, however, for Sanusi bu Hassan goes straight to his mark as a homing pigeon. Only in the middle of the day he sometimes wobbles a bit. In the daytime he travels by a shadow, and, as he explains, when the sun is high and the shadow lies between my feet, then my head goes round. There is one other hour in the day when the guide's task is a perplexing one. In the twilight hour between the setting of the sun and the appearance of the stars, all directions on the desert's vast disk are the same. Then sometimes the compass is useful. Once, by means of the bearing I had taken in the morning, I caught the guide in the hour between sun and stars going almost 90 degrees off the right direction. But, as a rule, the accuracy with which a good guide like Sanusi bu Hassan steers his course is almost uncanny. Our conference over and the last camels loaded, the guide sets out ahead, and one by one the camels follow. The men of the caravan have a last warm-up of hands and feet at the dying fire, thrust their feet into the Bedouin shoes, and hasten after the camels, singing gaily. The sun is getting warm by now, and unless there is a strong wind blowing from the north, one disposes quickly of wrappings on the ears of the neck and finally with the jird. The extra garments are flung on the backs of camels, jokes begin to crack, foot races are run, and everybody is happy to be alive. Gradually the men sort themselves into groups of 2 and 3, spaced at intervals along the caravan, chatting about their own affairs or about things in general. Sometimes I walk at the head of the caravan, and again some distance behind it, to keep an eye on the direction it is taking, and especially to enjoy the sense of solitude and remoteness. Toward midday, contemplation of the beauties of nature is sometimes disturbed by other and less romantic thoughts. My mind occasionally wanders toward favorite restaurants in faraway civilization. As I stride along, I imagine myself in Shepherd's grill room in Cairo, and I order crevette à l'américaine with that subtle variation of riz à l'orientale which is a specialty of the house. Or I am at Prunet's in Paris, ordering meringue verte d'Ostend, followed by a steak and a soufflé. Perhaps it is the cova at Milan and a succulent dish of risotto à la Milanese, maybe strawberries melba at the Ritz in London, or again a Circassian dish of rice with walnut sauce, which is the masterpiece of the old and beloved slave who really rules my father's house in Cairo, occupying the privileged position of a treasured nanny of long service in an English family. Suddenly Ahmad or Abdullahi comes along, and without a word pushes a bag of squashed dates into my palm. Dreams vanish, and I eat with as much appetite as though there were no better fare in all the world. There is no halt for lunch, as the camels eat only twice a day. If we have just left an oasis, there is fresh bread, half a loaf or even a whole one to each man, with dates. Later on that fresh bread becomes hard bread, and still later no bread at all. but there are always dates. I have one camel fitted up with a folded tent over its back, so that any one of us may lie and take his ease when tired of walking. Ahmed calls it the club. One day, at the lunch hour, Abdullahi demands where I am and whether I have had my portion of bread and dates or not, and Ahmed replies with a twinkling eye and an otherwise grave face, "The Bey is lunching at the club today." It is entirely possible, when you are used to it, to have a good nap on the camel's back, and an occasional ride is not to be scorned. But generally one walks, for the camel's pace of 2.5 miles an hour is an easy one to keep up with, and riding is often more tiring than going on foot. Sometimes during a whole day's trek, a narrow strip of water lies shimmering on the horizon ahead of the caravan. It never gets any nearer, but continues to beckon, a cool and pleasant invitation until the sun has rolled around to the west and the mirage vanishes away. It is a purely optical illusion, for there is no water there. Another kind of mirage comes sometimes in the early morning. Then the country far ahead of one appears in the sky at the horizon, as the Bedouins say, upside down. This is not, as the other variety of mirage is, entirely an illusion. It is really the reversed reflection of the country 30 or 40 kilometers ahead of where the observer stands. As the sun rises higher above the horizon, suddenly the mirage vanishes as magically as it came. There are also other tricks of reflection of light in the desert. Sometimes, for instance, a small pebble the size of a cricket ball seen from a mile away might assume the appearance of a big rock, standing like a landmark. The skeleton or part of the skeleton of a camel or a human being may take on the most fantastic shapes on the horizon, but the Bedouins know it well. It is absurd to say that the Bedouin is lured by the mirage out of his way, and even to his destruction. The seasoned desert traveler knows a mirage when he sees one. It is entirely possible, indeed, that the upside-down variety may be a positive assistance, since it can suggest what kind of country lies ahead. The mirage is an interesting phenomenon, but it is not one of the perils of desert travel. In the afternoon there are several hours of heat, the pace of the camels slackens, and the whole caravan becomes quiet and somnolent. As evening comes on and it grows cool again, the camels pick up their speed and go into a final spurt before the time for making camp. The men sing to the camels then to stimulate their efforts, and the beasts respond cheerfully to the encouragement. The songs are simple and poetic, full of the atmosphere of the desert life. One of them represents a Bedouin waiting at an oasis for the expected caravan. He sings to the approaching camels, "Gone is the night, come are the Mazaran to the morning sky. You are here, and vanished are all our fears." The singer speaks of his camels. In companies the sand dunes march to meet them, pointing the homeward way. The singer addresses his camels. The sand dunes hide many wells that brim with waters unfailing. You come to their margins like bracelets, wrought of gold and rare gems in far countries. In another, the singer is still addressing his camels. The wells lie hid in the dunes, masked by the sands drifted over them. You approach them in ones and twos, O you who reveal hidden places. The last song that I shall set down shows the traditional attitude of the Bedouin to his camel. It is his most precious possession. To give it up without a struggle to the death is dishonor. A Bedouin might wait to take revenge for the killing of a brother or a son, but if his camel were stolen, he would not rest until he found it and brought it back by force of arms if necessary. He who will not risk his life for his camel, says the Bedouin, does not deserve to have it. So the camel driver sings to his beast. For your sakes, O ye who cherish us, as loving mothers their children, for your sakes the sons of nobles have lain stark on the sands, unsheltered by tomb or burial. The men suit the song to the occasion. The first one that I have translated might be used when an oasis was not far off, the second when the caravan is approaching sand dune country, the third and fourth when they are nearing a well, and the last when entering a hostile region. At sunset I make it a point to be near the guide and unobtrusively to check him up with my compass in those uncertain hours before the stars come out. When the dark falls, a lantern is lighted and given to the guide. Then we follow that elusive pinpoint of yellow in the darkness. It winks a provocative invitation to follow, but we can never reach it. The camels like to have the lantern ahead of them and move briskly forward in pursuit. 12 or 13 hours of walking, if conditions have been good, bring us to the end of the day's trek, though sometimes we cannot go on for so long. "Eder ya ayan, home for you who are weary," is shouted by the guide and repeated by every man in the caravan. Then the men collect the camels and divide them, the water camels here, those carrying tents over there, the camels with luggage for the barricade yonder. The camels are barracked, kneel with grunts of satisfaction to have their loads removed. Now we must be vigilant, for men tired by a day's trek are likely to be careless and let boxes with precious instruments or cameras fall with disastrous violence. The baggage is arranged in a barricade, if the night promises to be windy, and the tents are pitched in their triangle, unless the night is particularly calm and pleasant. I could never decide which moment was fuller of satisfaction, that in which the tent was set up after a hard day's trek, or that in which it was pulled down, preliminary to taking the road again. Then the fire is built, and the leaping flames of the hatab throw a warm glow over the sand. The first thing is tea. Now I realize to the full the virtues of the dark, bittersweet liquid that the Bedouins know by that name. They make tea by taking a handful of the leaves and a handful of sugar and boiling them briskly in a pint of water. The result would drive a housewife of the West almost insane, but it is a wonderful stimulant after a hard day's trek in the desert, and a glorious reviver of one's energies and spirits. The men of the caravan are not slow to prepare and eat the evening meal, to feed the camels, and then dispose themselves for sleep. But I must compare my 6 watches and wind them, record the photographs made during the day, change the cinema films in the darkness, no mean feat in itself, label and store the geological specimens I have collected, and write up my diaries. The glasses of Bedouin tea which I have drunk help me to accomplish these duties, and then probably stimulate me for a walk in the desert. If there's no bitter cold wind, I go for perhaps a half a mile, looking back from time to time at the silhouette of the caravan against the sky, the dark masses of the tents, the baggage, and the kneeling camels, touched here and there with flickers of light from the dying fire, in the midst of that immense sea of sand, make a picture full of mystery and fascination. All about me is silence. There is no wind whispering in the leaves, no murmur of the waters of a brook such as one hears in the wooded wilds, no slap and plash and swish of waves against the ship's side such as are always present at sea. Nothing but silence. Silence, the sands, and the stars. End of section 10. Chapter 12. The Road to Ziegen Well. From this point I shall set down the days as they are recorded in my diary. Sunday, March 18th. Start at 9 a.m. Halt at 8:30 p.m. Make 46 kilometers. Highest temperature 21 degrees, lowest 3 degrees. Cloudy all day, clear in the evening, just a few drops of rain in the afternoon. Strong northeast wind, which develops at 2:30 into a sandstorm. Wind drops at sunset and gets up again at 8 in the evening. The sun is not visible and the guide's course not so straight as usual, as shown by the compass bearings which I take often during the day. At 5:30 the sun appears and he corrects his course. At 7:30 he is traveling by the North Star, which the Bedouins call El Jadi. The ground is generally the same as yesterday's, though slightly undulating. At intervals all day we come across patches of big, dark-colored pebbles. In the morning there was excitement when we sighted on the horizon the series of hazy dots that meant the approaching vanguard of a caravan. My binoculars were brought into play and passed around among the men. Rifles were unslung from their places on the camels' backs, and the Tebus ran to get their spears. The men ranged themselves on the side of the caravan nearest the oncomers, and held themselves alert until we should find out whether they were friendly or hostile. It did not take long to recognize them for friends. Then men from each party met and squatted down between the two caravans to exchange the news, while the two lines of camels plodded past. Tongues flew as they heard and told who had been married, who was dead, who had made money, what new feuds had arisen, or what old ones had been ended. Then the envoys sprang up, bade each other Godspeed, and hastened after their respective caravans. This is the desert wireless at work. Monday, March 19th. Start at 8:15 a.m. Halt at 8:30 p.m. Make 49 kilometers. Highest temperature 22 degrees, lowest 5 degrees. Weather fine and clear, strong northeast wind which drops at midday. Few white clouds in the afternoon. Sun is very warm, making our progress slow, but evening is cool and the pace is quickened. Ground very flat, hard sand covered with fine gravel. At 6 in the evening, cross a slight depression with a patch of gray stone on the right and a white stone on our left, about 2 kilometers distant. All of us, men and camels, were getting into our stride. The Bedouins and Tebus indulged in foot races and played practical jokes. The Tebus are simple, primitive fellows with delightfully naive habits of mind. Being poor, they take the best care of what possessions they have. They dress in a simple cotton shirt and a pair of drawers, and devote as much attention to making these garments last as long as possible. When a Tebu rides a camel, for instance, he takes off his drawers to save wear and tear and hangs them on his camel's back. When he sleeps, he also removes his garments to protect them from friction against the sand, and wraps himself in his fur cloak. While one of the Tebus was riding that day, some of the Bedouins took his drawers and hid them. When he alighted and looked for his garment, he immediately feared that it had dropped off and lay somewhere in the desert along our track. Without a moment's hesitation, he set out on the back track, running briskly in search of his precious possession. He had become a tiny figure in the vast expanse of sand before we took pity on him and fired shots to call him to return. He turned reluctantly and soon joined us with downcast face. But the merriment of the jokers told him that something was up, and when his drawers were produced, he was too pleased to get them back to resent the joke. The previous night, some of the camels paid a visit to my tent and threatened to have it down on top of me. They are clever beasts. They like to scratch their necks on the tent ropes, and when all the camp is asleep, they hobble in quest of this innocent form of diversion. First, the camel sticks his head through the flap of my tent to see if I am awake. If he does not hear me resent his intrusion, he then knows I am asleep, and out he backs and sets to scratching vigorously. Soon he is joined by others, and I awake under the impression that my tent is being assailed by a violent storm. Each day I was more impressed with Buhalega as a traveling companion. He was a man of few words, with a big heart and generous spirit. His years and his white hair and beard gained him the respect of all of us, for in the desert the man of experience, who is possessed of the wisdom that comes with age, is the invaluable one. Zerwali and I, therefore, referred continually to Buhalega's judgment. He was tactful in offering his suggestions for my consideration, but I was wise enough not to disregard them. He was constantly on the lookout for the well-being of the camels, and his splendid voice was heard at intervals through the day addressing the camels or the men. "The white camel is weary. Tomorrow, Ibrahim, we will shift its load to the old brown one," he says to his slave. "Talk to them, men, talk to them," he commands, knowing how much better the camels travel under encouragement. And again, "Sing to them, Ibrahim." "Follow the guide, you beautiful beasts," he exhorts the camels. "Pray, Ahmad, that saddle has shifted. It will irritate the camel's back. When the twilight comes, he gives the order, "Light the lantern. It pleases the camels." The qualities of the camel are seldom, if ever, appreciated on a slight acquaintance. The camel is as clever as a horse, if not more clever, and in some ways is more human. "Patient as a camel" is an Arab saying, and a very true one. If you ill-treat a camel, he will never forget it, but he will not attack you on the spot. He will wait, and if you repeat the offense again and again, he makes up his mind to get his revenge. Not, however, when there are many people about. Here he behaves in a most human way. He watches his chances until you and he are alone, and then he goes for you, either by snatching at you with his mouth and throwing you to the ground, or by kicking you and then trampling upon you. There is a case known where a camel trampled on a man and then sat on him, refusing to move even after punishment from the men who ran up to the rescue, wanting to make sure that he had finished the man, as indeed he had. People imagine that in the desert a camel has to be roped in and led. As a matter of fact, it is very hard in the desert to keep a camel away from the rest of the caravan, for instinctively he knows that to be left behind is death. So he keeps as near the bulk of the caravan as he can. It is a sad sight to see a camel struggling behind a caravan. It is like the soldier in retreat, unable to keep up with his comrades, knowing that nobody can carry him, and that to fall behind means disaster. The camel also displays his intelligence when he is taken from the oasis and pushed into the waterless trek. Instinctively he tries at night, even 3 or 4 days after the start, to go back to the oasis. There have been a few desert tragedies when all the camels have deserted the men at night, either on the outward or the homecoming journey, when the caravan was still a few days from its destination. Or in the event of some accident befalling a caravan, camels which have traveled a certain road for 10 or 15 years will complete the journey alone. As we were approaching Jallo, and 3 days' journey from the camp of the Bedouins from whom I had hired 3 camels, one of the latter fell desperately ill. They divided his load between the other 2 and left him in the desert. I all the time urging the Bedouins to kill him and save him the tortures of death. I even offered to pay them the price of the camel if they would allow me to put an end to him. But as the camel was a pedigreed beast, they refused. They said, "He is only feeling tired. He will go at his leisure back to the camp." I learned afterwards that the camel reached home safely and was feeling much better. Instinctively, again, the camel knows that he has a guide, and if you halt in the middle of the desert to debate some point in regard to the route, the camels crowd round the guide. The moment he moves, they follow him, ignoring the presence of every other member of the caravan, but never overtaking the guide. Or if occasionally a camel ignores even the guide and goes right ahead of a caravan, then it is safe for the caravan to follow that camel, for he certainly knows the place that the caravan is coming to. The Bedouins say that a camel who has once grazed in an oasis would find his way back to that oasis even if he were several days' journey from it. There is a famous Bedouin story of the sand grouse and the camel who had a competition. The sand grouse said, "I could lay my eggs in the desert, travel for days, and come back and hatch them." The camel retorted, "If my mother drinks from a well when I am still in her womb, I could travel for days and come back and drink from the same well." I myself have seen a camel head the caravan when we were 4 days from a well, the waters of which he had tasted 4 years before. There is a well-known case of one camel that saved a caravan which was going from Dakhla Oasis to the oasis at Uanat. The guide, who had never been to the place before, but was heading toward it, going by the description of another Bedouin, had lost his bearings, and the caravan wandered for 12 days aimlessly. The water was exhausted, and they had lost hope. Suddenly one of the camels headed the caravan, and they followed him. That camel had been to Uanat a few years before, and when he was 2 days' journey from Uanat, he smelled the place, as the Bedouins say, and landed the caravan right at one of the wells. In winter, the well-trained camel can go for a fortnight without water, in summer up to 12 days. The Bedouins try to feed their camels always on grazing grass if they can, but when they take them to the Dafa, or long waterless trek, they are fed on dried dates, and when the Bedouin can afford it, on barley. Most of the camels found in Cyrenaica are Hamla or pack camels. The best trotting camels are Tibus or Tuaregs, beautiful white beasts with slim limbs and graceful lines. The average good day's work of a pack camel is a distance of 25 miles. The thoroughbred Tuareg does up to 40 and has been known to do 70 miles at one stretch. The camel can become a very affectionate beast and very devoted to his master. Well-trained trotting camels or Hejans refuse to get up with anybody on their back but their own master. As a rule, the water is carried on the older and wiser camels, who go sedately with no attempt to frolic. They realize that they are carrying the most valuable asset to the whole caravan, and therefore, the moment the day's trek is over and we are at the hour of unloading, these older and wiser camels stand apart from the rest, for fear the sheepskins they are carrying be bumped. I have also seen camels walk around the camp and approach the sheepskins lying on the ground, arranged and covered for the night. The camels would take great care to walk around them. There was one camel that was trained for a long time to carry my tent and all my books and instruments. He was only chosen for that task because of his being a strong and old camel. Every morning when the loading started, he used to come of his own accord and barrack near my tent, and in his usual supercilious way, wait for the load to be put on his back. The camel is a jealous husband, or a faithful wife, as the case may be. The female camels will never leave their lord and master and always follow him, while woe betide any adventurous male camel who dares to attempt to butt in. Each morning and evening, Buhalega and I rode together and talked about camels and the desert and Bedouin history. I was careful to ask no direct questions, for the Bedouins are suspicious people ready to mistrust your motives. But casual remarks easily bring out interesting comments and information. "There was a time," said the venerable old man, "when Kufra was unknown to our people. A Bedouin of the Chawazi tribe from El Obeid, a small oasis near Boutefal Well, noticed a crow which kept flying away to the south and coming back again as regularly as the sun rises. He watched it for some time and then set out to follow its course southward. He finally reached Tizerbo and, after a day's stop on the outskirts of the oasis, managed to get enough water to take him back. On his return, he told his tribe of date trees and water in the heart of the desert. They formed an expedition which set out for Tizerbo and conquered it, after which they went on to Bozima, Ribiana, and eventually to Kufra itself. So the Bedouins came to Kufra." I had been casting covetous eyes on Buhalega's horse since I first saw it in Jallo. Abdullahi had inquired for me whether it could be bought, but the price was too high. So I affected indifference and bided my time. No one of Buhalega's family rode the horse but himself. The old man's dignity would not permit. But he kindly allowed me to use the animal whenever I wanted to ride. In fact, on this journey, it seemed more mine than his. 3 of the camels were tired and barracked, knelt down, without orders. They do not behave this way unless there is a good reason for it, and so we shifted their loads to let them have a rest. We lost time in the process, but made it up when the cool of the evening came. I made it a point to talk with each man in the caravan every day. It kept things running smoothly, and incidentally I picked up some interesting information. I learned on this day that the Bedouins not only knew the tracks of their own camels, but often could tell whether camels which have passed belong to men of the same tribe or not. Tebu camels they know at once because of the peculiar shape of their hoofs and the long strides they take. The Tebu camels are hardier than the Bedouin animals and can be used both in the northern desert of Cyrenaica and to the south in the Sudan. The Bedouins change camels at Kufra when going north or south. I walked with Sanusi ben Hassan, the guide, and he told me of a trick used by the Bedouins when they are herding camels or sheep. They milk the beasts in the morning and bury the milk in a gerba to keep it cool. But desert marauders are clever and can easily find where a gerba has been buried, so the wily Bedouin buries two gerbas, one beneath the other. The bottom one is full of fresh milk, and the top one of stale. The thief discovers the upper gerba and looks no further, while the owner of the gerbas finds his fresh milk safe when he returns at night. We met flocks of small birds winging their way north. Some of them were tired and eagerly accepted the water we offered them. One perched on my hand to drink. Sometimes near a well, one of those that is better described as a water hole, one sees a few wings, feathers, and bones of birds that tell their sad tale. They were probably immigrants who came across the well and stayed for a few days to recuperate. The well had just been dug by a passing caravan, water was easily available, and the birds grew accustomed to the spot. Little by little the sand drifted up and filled the well, and one day there was no more water, just a damp patch of sand. Or perhaps the birds arrived there too exhausted to fly another 100 or 200 miles in search of water, so they remained and died. In the morning at 10:30 we passed sand dunes called El Quimat, 8 or 10 kilometers to our left, like small white tents on the desert, as their name indicates. At 4:30 we sighted on our left at 30 kilometers the landmark called El Farayeg, 4 sand hills in a row. The name means the little band of men. At 6:15 we sighted the top of another landmark known as Bazul, the solitary one, hazy to the distance in the southeast. We were all cheered by the sight of these landmarks, which indicated our progress. We were confident that we had a skillful guide, but, as the Bedouins say, the good guide is known only at the well. It is only when one has reached the end of the journey that there is certainty that the right track had been taken. Sanusi bu Hassan demonstrated his remarkably keen eyesight. Very early in the morning, before breaking camp, he announced that he saw El Quimat landmark in spite of the morning mist. It was several hours before other eyes in the caravan could make it out. In the afternoon we passed camel skeletons lying white on the sands. Strangely enough, this is a cheering sign in the desert for 2 reasons. First, because in the trackless monotony, any sign that others have passed that way is encouraging, and second, because the camel bones are more frequent near the wells. Camels are more likely to die near the end of a trek when, if the water is scarce, they have been pushed too hard by their masters. The Bedouins do not like to use the word skeleton when they find such a reminder that death has come to this way, so they euphemistically call it gazelle, which means gazelle. Thursday, March 22nd. Up at 5:30 a.m., I watched the sunrise at 6:27 a.m. and recorded its time. We started at 8 a.m. and made 48 kilometers over very flat country, hard sand and gravel. All the morning the Mazul sand dunes were on our left, 25 kilometers distance, but by the afternoon we had passed them. In the morning I heard Zerwali and Abdullahi discussing this land of astounding flatness through which we were passing. "Yes, our country is a blessed one," said Zerwali. "Yes, indeed, it has a wonderful future," answered the man from Egypt. "It is here, I believe, that the day of reckoning will be held. It is the only place God could find that would be big enough and so empty." The Tebus were running far and wide, ahead and each side of the caravan in search of camel dung for fuel. They lived their life a little apart from the others in the caravan, and so they liked to have their own campfire at night, a short distance from the main camp. Camel dung was the only available fuel. The Tebus, who are sturdy runners, would go as much as 5 miles out of their way to find the precious material. But the Bedouins objected to the Tebus' habit of running ahead and seizing all the dung. It is an inflexible rule of the desert that anything found on the way belongs to him who first touches it, and the Tebus appealed to that rule for justification. The Bedouins, however, had a telling retort. "You have no guide ahead, nor do you let your camels go first, where they will not go without the stick," they said. "You want us to lead the way for your camels, while you run ahead and seize the dung. That dung belongs to us, who would come upon it first if you were back with your camels where you belong." The controversy grew spirited, and was finally brought to me for judgment. I decreed that the Bedouins were right, and the Tebus should have no fire of their own. They should, however, be given a hot meal from the General Commissariat every night. The Tebus are quite different in many of their habits and customs from the Bedouins. They often do not use fire in the preparation of their food, though, as I have shown, they do not reject it for comfort and cheer. They dry the inside of the bark from the top of a date tree over a fire and powder it to use as a material for a kind of pudding. They mix it with dates and locusts, also powdered. They invite no one to share their meals, as the Bedouins invariably do, nor are they resentful if others do not ask them to share their food. The Bedouins criticize vigorously this failure in hospitality, as they consider it. The Tebus leave nothing behind on the track, having a superstitious fear that whoever picks up what they have dropped would get hold of them too. They are fine physical specimens and good workers, but extremely simple in their habits of life and mind. They are mixing more and more with the Bedouins, however, and learning the Bedouin ways. On this day, one of the camels became ill. Buhalega got down and walked behind it, and then bled it from the tail. We hoped it would be better after a night's rest. As we were sure of our water supply, we decided to have a glass of tea. Buhalega, Zerwali, Abdullahi, and I went on ahead of the caravan, taking the guide with us to set our course right. When we were far enough ahead, we quickly made a fire and brewed tea. As the caravan came up, we handed a glass of tea to each man as he passed. The caravan did not stop. When the last camel was past us, we packed up our paraphernalia and hastened to catch up with the plodding caravan, Buhalega on his camel, Zerwali and Abdullahi riding double on a trotting camel, and I on the horse. I must own Baraka was useful to me for several purposes. With him, the camels could be easily brought back from the grazing ground, which they are reluctant to leave to enter the Zaria again. I could ride him to visit places of interest when we halted at oases, allowing the camels to rest or graze. I could go ahead of the caravan with him, or remain behind to make observations or secure specimens unwatched by the men. On his back I could make a properly dignified appearance at the head of my caravan when entering or leaving an oasis. Friday, March 23rd. We made 36 kilometers. There was a strong northeast wind the previous night, starting an hour after midnight. This wind continued all day, increasing from 1 to 3, and dropped in the evening. It was fair and clear, but cloudy in the late afternoon. At 5 in the afternoon, we sighted the sand dunes called El Mazil, 25 kilometers toward the southeast. The men had become interested in making a full day's trek, and exerted every effort to be under way at 8, intending to walk for 12 hours. But the sick camel interfered with our plans. When the time came to start, it had to be lifted to its feet. Buhalega shook his head and said, "This camel will be flesh to eat before the day is over." 2 hours later the camel knelt and refused to rise. In a few minutes it had to be slaughtered. 3 men and 2 camels were left to bring the flesh after us. Before we had gone far, Buhalega came trotting up on his horse and said, "It is a fat camel. Let us stop for a while." Knowing the Bedouins' love of meat, I halted the caravan while a fire was made and a feast prepared. Everyone ate the meat but myself and my 2 Egyptian servants. Buhalega asked why I did not join the feast, and I told him that I did not care to eat the flesh of a sick camel. "It is better than the little fish," he said, referring to some tins of sardines which we had with us. "We have seen the camels slaughtered, but who knows what happened to the little fish since they were in the sea?" The camel's flesh, which was not eaten at once, the Bedouins dried and cut into thin shreds for flavoring their rice and asida later on. When we started again in the afternoon, Sanusi Bu Hassan said to me, "We will walk until we knock off the young moon, and then we will be able to lunch at the well tomorrow." But when evening came, clouds hid El Jadi before the young moon had set, and we had to stop and make camp at 10:30 for fear of losing our way. In this part of the desert there was little to discover externally, but a great deal to discover in oneself that could only be brought to light in the silence and calm. It makes all the difference in the world whether one goes through the journey with the intention of getting back as quickly as possible to civilization again, or whether one lives and enjoys every moment of it. Just as the sun was going down, I saw Zerwali sitting by himself, drawing lines on the sand with a meditative finger. He was doing this yazurga, or science of the sands, with which the Bedouin tells his own fortune. At intervals his eyes lifted from the pattern before him and brooded dreamily on the vivid colors of the sunset. The Bedouin has an appreciation of beauty and a reverence for nature. How could he help it? Day after day it is exactly the same. The photographs I took in those 7 days might be pictures of the same camp from different angles, so persistently the same was the immense, desolate expanse of sand, unmarked except for a camel's skeleton or a few pebbles the size of a walnut. There was nothing to distract one's mind or interrupt one's contemplation. What a peculiar charm this desolate desert has! What a cleansing effect on one's mind and body! How this constant touch with infinity, day by day and night by night, affects the mind and the spirit and alters one's conception of life. How small and petty one's efforts in the round of ordinary civilization seem. How insignificant one's efforts in this desert actually are. Saturday, March 24th. We were up at 5:30 a.m., tired, for we went to bed at 2. It was fine and clear all day. A northeast breeze in the morning dropped at midday, leaving it very warm. A strong northeast wind got up again at 10 p.m. At 9:30 a.m. the country began to change slightly. The sand was softer and the ground a little undulating. At 10 we came across patches of black, broken stone which continued all day. At noon we sighted on our right the first hatab, dried brushwood, of Zigan Valley. At 1:45 we halted for a hot meal and a rest near the first hatab we reached. Our fuel supply was exhausted the previous day, and we had had nothing hot to eat or drink since the morning of the day before. At 5:13 we sighted sand dunes to the southeast, about 40 kilometers distant. The dunes ran southward in a line towards Zigan Valley. At 8:30 the hillocks of Hatab increased in number and extent. When we started in the morning, we hoped to get to Zigan that day. Later there was disagreement as to why we had not reached it. Buhalega remarked that the guide must have gone too far to the west, or we should have arrived at the well before this. Zerwali, who had selected Bu Hassan for our guide, came to his defense. It was because we lost time slaughtering the camel and feasting the day before that we did not arrive, he said. Ahmad had another explanation. The camels are not being driven at all, he said. One sleeps long and gets up at his leisure, and the camels are still in sight. It was the custom of the men to drop out of line for a nap of a half-hour or so, the slow pace of the camels and their track in the sand making it possible for them to catch the caravan easily on wakening. When we halted to make a fire and have the first hot meal in 30 hours, I remembered that this was just where we had lost our way on the previous trip to Kufra in 1921. After our meal, Dawood, Zerwali's uncle, left us with a single camel to go to Tizerbo, which lay a day's journey west of Zigan. He proposed to get his wife and daughter and take them to Cyrenaica, where there were better prospects for business. Zerwali had agreed to help him in his affairs in the new region. It must have taken a lot of pluck for the old man to undertake the long journey to the north with 2 women and but a single camel. I asked him how he would manage it. He told me that the first day they would all walk. The next day, as the weight of water on the camel grew less, his daughter would ride, and on the third day his wife. "But suppose something happens to your camel?" I asked. "Protection comes from God," was his quiet answer. I gave him rice, macaroni, tea, and sugar, and when we had said the Fatah, he departed very happy. The Bedouins were delighted with a great feast of rice and camel flesh, and we went to bed in vast contentment. It was a beautiful night, and I left my tent and spent a few tranquil moments under the golden moon and the stars paled by her brighter light. Their serene cheerfulness and encouraging company sent me back to my bed, as always, with new hope and confidence. This is the entry in my diary for the following day. Sunday, March 25th. Start at 7:45 a.m. Halt at 1:45 p.m. Make 24 kilometers. Highest temperature 32 degrees, lowest 14. Strong northeast wind all last night and until 4:30 today. Cloudy all the morning, no sun, a few drops of rain at midday. It clears in the afternoon. We walk all the way among little hillocks of dry hatab, gradually increasing from a few inches to 8 feet in height as we near the well. The hillocks are interspersed with patches of sand strewn with bits of black broken stone. The sand gets gradually softer until it is moist a few inches under the surface. At 9:15 we sighted to the southwest, about 3 kilometers away, the sand dunes of El Washka, a small well of the Zigan group. At 9:30 we passed on our left Matan Buhu, the old well of Zigan. We camped near the few date trees that stand by the best well of the group, El Harash. In the desert, a well does not mean a nicely excavated and stoned-up arrangement such as one finds in other parts of the world, with a bucket and windlass or a pump. In this part of the desert, a well is a spot where water is close to the surface and can be easily obtained by digging. It is just a damp patch of sand which the Bedouins scrape open with their hands, getting water at 3 or 4 feet down. Between the visits of caravans, the sands drift over the place and choke the water hole, so that each newcomer must clean it out for himself. But the joy of an ample supply of fresh water, after days of having just enough for making tea, with no chance of a bath or even a shave, is sufficient reward for all the labor of digging out the well. If it has been a long journey, the first thing to think of is the camels. After they have been watered and a good meal digested, washing is the most important item in the program. If the water is scarce, clothes have to wait until the next well, because the question of water for the trek has to be considered. As soon as the men have rested, sheepskins are filled and left for the night. Early next morning, 2 or 3 men go to see which of the sheepskins has leaked, and if possible detect the cause of the leakage. They also make a point of separating the bad sheepskins from the good ones, so that on the journey water should be taken on the first day or 2 from those which leak or are unreliable. The first night at a well, however tired the caravan may be, is always made the opportunity for great rejoicing, singing, and dancing. Before arriving at the well, one's idea of a rest has been at least 4 or 5 days' stay and plenty of water to make up for past privation. Thoughts dwell on the pleasing idea of really having water to splash about with. Curiously enough, after a single day's rest, a fever of restlessness gets hold of one once again, and the luxury of abundance is left most eagerly for the privations of the road. No matter if it be a big well, surrounded by a fertile oasis, full of comforts of life, yet one returns with a sigh of contentment to the 12 hours' trek and the lunch of dried dates. The well, when scraped out, is probably about the size of a tea table for 2. The moist sand holds the walls together. Usually one leaves it alone a little for the sand to settle, but the water is always sandy, and it is too much bother to strain it. Not on one single occasion did I drink a glass of water that was not cloudy, and never did I see the bottom of my zinc cup while drinking. The filter which kind friends said I must take with me, I never used at all until we got to the Sudan, and there the water was really bad. In an inhabited area, you did not know what may have happened to it. And when we tried to get this famous filter working, we found there were no washers for it, so that was the end of the story of the filter. Dirt in the desert, it may be necessary to remark, is quite different from dirt anywhere else. It is not unwholesome, for the sand is a clean thing, and the clothes of the Bedouins let in the air. Vermin is there, but it is inevitable, and the Bedouin pays no heed to it. I might have just had my bath, and then I would go and sit down for a glass of tea with my men, and, well, you are bound to collect these things. End of section 11.